Out in small-town rural Texas, there are old forgotten homesteads with long, often ancient pasts. When one family takes advantage of a cheap piece of land and moves out there, they discover something that was left behind and promptly remove it. It does not take long for them to realize it was there for a very important reason. This story is called The Red Circle and was sent to me anonymously. Every house has a history, and sometimes history repeats itself. The asking price should have told me everything. 40 acres and a 3-bedroom ranch house in Terrell County, Texas, for a figure I'd have expected to pay for a used SUV with cosmetic damage. I checked the title 3 times for liens, pulled the tax history, ran the parcel number through every database my work credentials could access. The property was clean. I assumed, as anyone would, that the remoteness accounted for the price. Sanderson is 2.5 hours from the nearest city that qualifies for a city, and even then the city is Odessa, which qualifies only technically. We moved in at the end of summer. The heat was the kind that makes you feel personally disliked by the sky. Renee sat in the passenger seat with her sunglasses on, not talking, which I'd learned from 11 years of marriage could mean she was angry or tired or simply finished with the day's conversation before it even started. Lily slept in her car seat, face red and damp with her mouth open, looking like a small drunk. Cody had his headphones on, watching something on the tablet. The dogs were in the back of the truck, pressed flat on the bed, ears pinned by wind. The house appeared on the horizon slowly, like the land was still deciding whether to let us see it. First the roofline, then the walls, then the scrub yard and the leaning fence posts. It looked like something a child would draw if you asked them to draw a house, and they were only being half honest about it. The proportions weren't quite right. Additions had been made to the original structure at least twice, and whoever did the work had not worried much about matching materials or maintaining the roofline. The eastern side of the house sat slightly higher than the western side. I loved it immediately, though. I know how that sounds. Renee looked at it and took her sunglasses off, then put them back on, saying, "Okay." That was the tone she used when she decided she would survive something, to tolerate it. But I had wanted land since I was a boy, sharing a wall with a family of 5 in a San Antonio apartment complex. Back then, the hallways always smelled of pine sol and cooking grease. 40 acres was more land than anyone in my family had ever touched. The size of the sky out there made my chest feel loose for the first time in years. The silence, which Renee would later call aggressive, felt to me like the first clean breath after years of breathing through a cloth. The Starlink dish went up on the roof the second week. I'd done the coverage check before we made the offer. Without it, I had nothing. My contract work required a stable connection, and my clients didn't care that I'd moved to a place where cell service arrived and departed with the mood of the atmosphere. The landline in the kitchen worked, technically, but it hummed with static when the wind blew, which was almost always. And the sound it made when you held the receiver to your ear was like someone pressing their mouth very close to a microphone and breathing. I found the line on the 6th day, while walking the perimeter of the house, looking for foundation cracks. The slab had settled unevenly. A hairline fracture ran along the southeast corner, and I'd been following it with my finger when I noticed a band of red on the ground about 40 feet out from the wall. A mineral deposit of some sort, I thought. Some oxidized stripe in the caliche. But I followed it, and it curved, and that curve went on and on, bending around the house in a rough circle. It was thick and uneven, painted directly onto the hardpan. It was red like the floor of a mechanic's garage, painted over with a safety zone. When I crouched and scratched at it with my boot heel, it came up in layers, one shade of red over another, over another. Someone had painted this circle many times. The oldest layers had faded to the color of dried blood on a bandage. The top coat was newer, maybe 5 or 6 years old, but the sun and wind had started on it. I told Renee about it over dinner. She asked if it was something to do with septic drainage. I said probably. Then Cody asked if it was a pentagram that was never finished. "Boy, just eat your chicken," I said. Lily ignored the conversation entirely, feeding a piece of broccoli to the dog under the table. The dog accepted it without enthusiasm, which was unusual for that dog. Renee asked me to get rid of it on the second weekend. She had been walking the yard with Lily, looking for a place to put a garden box, and that line was starting to bother her. "It looks like someone was trying to keep something out," she said, then laughed, but only with her mouth. I agreed that it was ugly. I'd been planning to pressure wash the porch anyway, so I dragged the hose out, working my way around the circle over the course of one afternoon. The paint came up easily enough under the spray. The water cut through it and turned the soil dark, and the dark soil dried almost immediately in the heat, as if the ground was thirsty enough to drink it before I could finish a section. By 4 o'clock the line was gone and the ground looked clean. I felt satisfied. Being a new homeowner with control over your own property has that effect. That night, the dogs barked from 10 in the evening until nearly 3 in the morning, then stopped at the same moment, both of them mid-bark, like a recording that had been switched off. The silence after that was worrying. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle and tick. I tried to tell myself that the quality of the darkness in the room was the same as it had been every night so far. But I knew it wasn't. It was thicker that night. It had something to it I could only describe as attentive, which is not a good word to describe darkness. But that dark that night, it felt loaded or pressurized. The sky outside was clear and full of stars, and the stars looked very far away. In the morning, I was astonished. Every door in our house had been opened. Interior doors, cabinet doors, the oven and the dishwasher, the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, that little door on the front of the dryer where you clean the lint trap. Every single thing that could be opened had been opened, and everything stood wide. Renee asked if I'd done it. I asked if she had. Then we asked the kids. Cody said no, and he seemed offended that we would ask him that. Lily was eating cereal and didn't answer. Then again, she was only 4. Cereal was way more interesting than some question. We closed everything and moved on with our day. We had just uprooted our lives for a dream I'd been carrying since childhood, and closing some doors and moving on was the best option that we had to help us keep going. I think we settled on sleeping through some sort of earthquake, a small one that can open some doors and leave things ajar. Yeah, maybe it was cope. The next few nights I slept badly. I didn't have nightmares in the traditional sense. What I did have was this feeling. I would wake up at some odd hour in the night, and I'd feel like someone had just been standing beside the bed and had taken a single step backward the instant my eyes began to open. The feeling was so specific and so physical that I would lie still and listen for breathing that wasn't mine or Renee's. But I would hear nothing, even though that feeling of not being alone in our room persisted. Then Renee started to find her things moved. Her keys were in the freezer. Her phone was in the mailbox at one point at the end of our driveway, which was a quarter-mile from our house. She found her reading glasses in Lily's toy bin, folded neatly and placed on top of a stuffed rabbit. She blamed the kids, and it kinda did make the most sense, because otherwise how do things like that wind up where they did? It was either the kids or the world's dumbest burglar. I watched her face when she said it was the kids, and I could see she didn't fully believe it. But I also could see that I think we all needed to believe it, so I didn't go against her on that. Before long, the smell started. It came in around the second week. Pretty faint at the start of it, and I mean genuinely faint. I wasn't sure it was even real until I smelled it in 2 separate rooms on the same evening. I would describe it as sulfur-like, cut with something earthy and flowery, like water left at the bottom of a flower pot. A nursery school teacher I'd known as a kid kept a vase like that on her desk for an entire semester, refilling the water but never changing the flowers. And by April, the classroom had that same sour, sweet rot, organic decay, something floral underneath, neither disguising the other. That was the smell. I noticed the smell was strongest in our hallway, the one that ran from the bedrooms to the kitchen in a straight line, about 30 feet if I had to guess. During the day it was just a hallway, but at night it felt longer than it actually was. I know it sounds like a metaphor when I say it, but I'm not meaning it as a metaphor, but literally. Like when I walked from the bedroom to the kitchen at 2 a.m., the hallway seemed to contain more space than it did during the day. The walls seemed farther apart. The ceiling seemed higher. The bathroom door, which I could normally reach in 6 steps from our bedroom, took 8 or 9 steps, and I would arrive at the kitchen, winded, disoriented, unsure of how long I'd been walking. Of course, a guy like me, I had to measure it. I'm a man who works with structured data, and I measured the hallway at 2 p.m. and again at 2 a.m. with the same tape measure, and I got the same number both times. 31 feet and 4 inches. Well, I guess that number meant nothing. The hallway didn't care what the tape measure said. I knew there was no way the sizes were the same. Around the same time, I found the marks on the doors. I noticed them first on the back door, which I used every morning to let out the dogs. 4 vertical scratches in the paint, running from chest height down to the handle. They were deeper than my fingernail when I ran my finger across it. But it didn't look like an animal had done it. It almost looked like a man or person had. But who scratches their own door? I didn't think either me or Renee would do it, and the kids didn't have the strength to leave marks like that. The front door had them as well, same height and spacing, drawn down the wood with a steady, even pressure from top to bottom. The hand that made them did not vary and did not seem to tire. I checked the door in the garage. 4 scratches. The frame of the window above the kitchen sink. 4 scratches. The sill of the window in Cody's room on the outside, which I could only see by leaning out over the frame. 4 scratches. Fresh enough that the curls of stripped paint still clung to the wood. Not long after that, the dogs stopped going outside. They had been reluctant since the night we washed the line, but now they flat out refused. They'd stand at the back door when I opened it, looking out at the yard with their ears flat and bodies low. When I saw their tails pressed between their legs so tightly their tails trembled, I knew something was wrong. If I stepped out and called at them, they would whine and back up instead. They slept in the kitchen, huddled so close together with each other under the table. And during the day they followed Renee from room to room, desperately seeking her attention. Those dogs had decided that they were her dogs, and Renee had never had a say in the matter. Our older dog, a shepherd mix named Dutch, developed a habit of staring at the hallway from the kitchen threshold. He would sit there for hours with his head slightly lowered, watching the corridor, and if anyone walked through the hallway, he would track them with his eyes. I could see the fur along his spine lift and settle and lift again. What was he looking for, I wondered. One night during the second week, I got up to get some water. The hallway was doing that thing again, where it seemed to be stretched out. I walked it slowly. My legs felt stiff, and the air in the corridor had that quality again of thickness and not being alone. And unsurprisingly, the smell was back. I was passing Cody's door when I heard something outside the house, a sound that I initially processed as the wind. You see, the wind is always blowing out there, so you learn to subtract it from everything else you hear. But this sound had a regularity to it that wind doesn't have, a sort of rhythm. Something was circling the house. I could hear it in the gravel and scrub on the north side, a soft crunching evenly paced. Then it moved to the east side. The sound continued at the same tempo, then the south, and then the west, then the north again, a full circuit. Whatever was making the sound was walking the perimeter of the house in a circle, which happened to match the path where the red line used to be. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to it complete 3 circuits. On the 3rd circuit, it stopped on the western side, directly outside the wall of Lily's bedroom. There was silence then, for perhaps 30 seconds. Then a low, resonant hum, nearly below the range of hearing, but I could feel it slowly traveling through my bones. It stopped, and the wind was just the wind again. I went back to bed, confused. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, feeling exhausted inside and out. I forced myself to sleep before I could think too much about things. Lily began to talk to someone around the 3rd week. I heard it through the wall of her bedroom. She would talk and pause as if waiting for someone to reply, then talk again. Here and there would be little laughs and short answers. I went in her room, asking her who she was talking to. "The sad man," she said. She was sitting on her bed with a crayon in one hand and a coloring book open to a page of farm animals. She hadn't colored inside any of the lines. "Where's the sad man, sweetheart?" "He's in the wall. He says he used to live here and he misses somebody." "Okay, what else does he say?" "Well, he says you washed away his work and that it was important." She sounded like she was scolding me, then went right back to coloring, filling in a horse with a blue crayon. She was 4 and the conversation was over for her. No amount of standing in the doorway was going to reopen that conversation. I put my hand on the frame, and I felt the wood. It just felt like wood. But hearing her say what she said was yet another thing that was making this house feel more alive. The wall she'd pointed at was the western wall. It faced the yard, and beyond the yard, the shed. Now, I should tell you about the shed. It sat around 80 yards from the house, closer to the western fence line. It was built from cinder blocks with a corrugated metal roof. It didn't have any windows. The door was a heavy wooden slab, a single thick piece that did not match anything you'd buy at a hardware store. And a padlock held it shut, rusted to the color and texture of a scab that had been picked at and reformed many times. I told my kids to stay away from that thing. The structure looked unsound, and that was true. But over time, it was also true that the shed was making me feel uneasy, just like the rest of the house. Speaking of the house, it showed its age honestly. Cracked caulk, sun-bleached paint, wasp nests everywhere, and sand tended to drift into every seam and corner. That desert had been weathering the house for 60 years. The house clearly bore those wounds, but the shed did not. The roof wasn't rusted through, and the cinder blocks were not crumbling. The mortar between them looked almost recent, in fact. It sat out there in the scrub, kept and tended to by no one I could see, and I had not gone inside it because I had not wanted to. I was busy with the house, my family, my Starlink, and my contract. I cut the padlock with bolt cutters on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after we moved in, 2 days after Lily started talking to the wall, or rather the sad man. The lock resisted and then gave with a brittle crack, like breaking a stick of chalk. The door swung inward on hinges that moved a little too smoothly. Inside, there was a single room, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a concrete floor swept so clean that the broom marks were still visible in the dust, parallel lines running corner to corner. A wooden table was pushed against the back wall, and the surface was covered in ring marks from mugs and cans, and what looked like candle wax, layered and scraped and relayered over years. The air inside was cool and still, which made no sense for a cinder block box in the West Texas sun. It should have been a baking oven in there. Instead, the air had a damp chill to it, like a cellar would, and the coolness seemed to rise from beneath the floor. On the table and on shelves made from planks and cinder blocks, I found what the previous owner had left behind: an old Coleman lantern with a cracked mantle. There was also a plastic jug, empty, that still smelled faintly of kerosene. There were several mason jars filled with a coarse white substance that I later determined was salt. There was also a coffee can packed with dried sage, brittle and gray. Then I found the notebooks. His name was Harlan Cull. The name had been written inside the cover of the first notebook, where he wrote it in block letters alongside a date, September 2004. There were maybe a dozen of these notebooks, the cheap composition kind with the marbled black and white covers. They reminded me of the ones I'd use in middle school for vocabulary lists. They were filled front to back in handwriting that began small and controlled, but progressively fell apart over what I estimated to be several years of entries. I read through the notebooks over the course of 3 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, while Renee watched TV in the living room, the hallway between us doing its trick of feeling stretched. What I pieced together from that information was this. Harlan moved to the property after his wife died. He chose the isolation, but something started to happen almost right away, and his early entries described it. Doors open in the morning, objects displaced, that smell in the hallway, and sounds at night, specifically what he called a breathing in the walls, which he initially thought was pipes or wind. The entries changed over the first year. The precise and careful handwriting eroded. He began repeating the same observations, writing them down again and again, as if he was trying desperately not to forget, or to remind himself. He tried salt, then sage, then a priest from Alpine who came once, performed something, and never returned. Harlan wrote about calling the diocese 3 times afterward, but he was told that the priest was unavailable. He tried sealing the doors with weather stripping, and he tried sleeping in the shed at times. One time he tried to leave. He drove 40 miles toward Fort Stockton before turning around because, and I quote, "It's worse to know it's here and not be watching it." Ugh, that line gave me chills. Then he found the books. They were still on the shelves when I opened the shed. 3 of them, cheaply printed and dense, perfectly bound, like small academic press-run books. The titles seemed to be in Latin and English, and the publishers were names I'd never seen before and could not find when I searched for them later. One of them had a chapter marked with a strip of electrical tape, and that chapter described a category of entity that attached to grief. That entity does not arrive, the book said. It accretes. It builds itself from the particular energy of a person who has lost someone they loved and cannot, in some fundamental interior place, release them. The grief becomes material. It accumulates, slowly, and eventually reaches a kind of critical mass. That's when it becomes conscious, and that's when it starts to want things. It wants doors, it wants a body, it wants to dissolve the boundaries between spaces, between inside and outside, between the living and the dead, and whatever else there might be. The line was Harlan's answer. In one of the later notebooks, he described finding the instructions in one of the books. The language he used was a declared perimeter, which he described as a boundary maintained by active human intention. Paint it on the ground, renew it regularly, walk it daily, and keep it watched. The entity could not cross it as long as someone was choosing to enforce it. The moment attention lapsed, the moment the paint faded and no one repainted it, that boundary became abstract, and abstract boundaries meant nothing to that thing in the walls. Harlan maintained the line for what I calculated to be 15 years, from approximately 2004 to his death in 2019. His notebooks were filled with the maintenance of that line, about which sections faded the fastest and how weather affected coverage. He even described what happened the one time he let a section go thin. A single entry from November 2014 that read, "The south side, rain washed the paint. It got through. I will not let that happen again." There were no details about what "got through" actually meant, and that lack of detail was what really troubled me, because I kept thinking about what that could mean. Harlan died in the house, sitting in a kitchen chair facing the front door. I found his obituary in the online archive of a paper I'd never heard of. 3 sentences saying, "Longtime resident, no surviving family, private services." Driven entirely by curiosity, I began to pull some data. My work credentials gave me access to title search databases. I ran the parcel number and pulled the chain of ownership. The property had changed hands 6 times since 1979. Average stay, 3 to 4 years. One family lasted just 8 months. I found a gap between 1981 and 1986, during which the county held the title, and a note in the digital record said, "Structure condemned," though no condemnation report was attached, and the house had clearly been reoccupied after that. The pattern looked, to someone like me, like a recurring error in a system. The same input producing the same failed output, over and over, but no one ever fixing it. In a scan of a county assessor's file, I found a photograph. It was a Polaroid, uploaded at low resolution, which depicted the house taken from a distance. The image was poor, but I could see the red line on the ground, faded and splotchy, but unmistakably the same circle. The metadata on the scan said the original photo was dated 1983 on the back. So the line had been there 20 years before Harlan Cole even arrived. Harlan never created the first line. He had just found it, just as I had found it. But he recognized it for what it was, or learned what it was, and he restored it, took care of it, until he died in a kitchen chair facing the front door. I realized that was the only door he could watch from that position. That man had probably been sitting there watching for 15 years. Over those days that I read all of this, I couldn't believe it. I believed that Harlan Cole was a lonely man who had lost his wife, so he came to the desert and slowly disassembled in the heat and the solitude. The notebooks were some sort of record of a mind turning in on itself, struggling to cope with trauma and loneliness, building a mythology around the ordinary creaks and smells of an old house. Despite how creepy these books and notebooks were, this is what I believed. Until the night I stopped in the hallway outside Lily's room at 2:47 a.m., and I once again heard her talking. Her half of the conversation was simple. Those short sentences that 4-year-olds do. "Okay. Why?" "That's silly." And then she laughed, a real good laugh. But after she was done laughing, I heard it, through the wall. A sound at the lowest edge of my hearing, more vibration than voice. There was someone in there with my daughter. I opened the door. Lily was sitting up in bed, facing the western wall, the one she said the sad man was in. She turned to look at me, and her face did something. For perhaps half a second she looked at me with an expression that did not belong to my daughter. She looked older than she actually was, and angry, like I'd interrupted something important. A flicker of irritation and authority which could not come from my child. It crossed her features and was gone. In the same suddenness, she was Lily again, small and sleepy. She said to me, "Daddy, I was talking." Then she lay back down and closed her eyes. I stood in the doorway and put my hand on the western wall. It was warm. The rest of the house was cool. The AC had been running all evening, and the hallway air had that dry, conditioned chill to it. But that wall was warm. Something inside that wall was giving off its own heat. Something alive and resting just behind the sheetrock where my daughter slept every night. I would be repainting the line the next morning. I drove to Fort Stockton, as Sanderson doesn't have a hardware store. An hour each way. I bought 4 cans of red exterior paint, the cheapest kind. I mean, from what I saw, Harlan also used cheap paint, and I wasn't about to improve upon the methods of a man who kept this thing contained for 15 years. I started at the point on the north side, where I could still see the faintest trace of the old line, a discoloration of the caliche that was invisible unless you knew it was there. I painted the full circle in one afternoon. The paint went down easily enough, soaking into the ground, and I worked steadily. My wife probably saw me bent at the waist with a brush and the sun bearing down on my neck. When I was finished, I stood at the edge of the circle and looked back at the house, which now sat once more within a red perimeter, and I felt relief, like a problem had been solved, sort of like I dodged a bullet. That night, every door in the house stayed closed. The dogs went outside for the first time in a week and lay in the yard, sleeping. The hallway was 31 feet and 4 inches long and actually felt that way all day long. And I was able to sleep through the night for the first time since we'd arrived. Nothing woke me up out of nowhere. I woke instead to the ordinary heat of a Texas morning. And the quietness and peace outside was the good kind. The house finally felt like just a house. This lasted 10 days. I checked that line every morning. I walked the full perimeter as Harlan had, looking for cracks, maybe some fading, or places where wind-blown sand was beginning to cover the paint. I found some, and when I did, I would touch them up. The desert weathers down everything. The wind will file paint down grain by grain, and the sun will bleach it, and the sand will just cover it. Given enough time, it would erase this whole circle, in some way. And whatever lay beyond the line, well, I was sure it had all the time in the world. I began to think of the maintenance, something I had not planned for to live out here. This would from now on require my daily attention, or it would fail again, like it was some roof or fence needing patched. But as stressful as it sounded, I soon realized I didn't mind the work. The mornings were nice. I'd always been a morning person. The light came in gold from the east, and the air was cool still before being warmed up by the sun, and it smelled of creosote and dust. I would walk the circle with my brush and can, and I felt, for about half an hour each day, important and satisfied. It kind of reminded me of my database work, building a clean schema. The line was a kind of query. It asked the desert a question every day, and the answer so far was the right one. Again, during those 10 days, the house felt like a normal house. Even that smell had gone. I found Renee humming while cooking. The dogs were now rolling around in the dirt outside, playing. Lily was playing with her toys alone or talking to herself, usually narrating her own actions in third person, not talking to some other entity. That voice in the wall was absent. Cody found me on the line on a Saturday morning. I was on the western side with a brush and a can of paint, as usual, touching up a section that had faded just slightly. I looked up, and he was standing about 10 feet away from me. He was watching me awkwardly. I could tell he'd been there a while. "Why are you painting a circle around the house?" he asked. I started to say something about marking underground utilities or something. The words were halfway up my throat when Cody cut me off. "I saw something standing out here last night." I set the brush across the top of the paint can. "Where did you see it?" He pointed past the line, into the scrub, toward the fence line and the miles of nothing beyond it. "About there, past the red. It was standing still." "Oh, it's nothing, son, just some animal." "It was the size of a person, but it didn't look like a person." He paused, squinting. "The arms were in the wrong spots, or the legs were. It was hard to tell because it was pretty far away. It was standing up, but it looked like it didn't know how to stand up yet. And its head was on sideways. It kept moving its fingers, all of them really fast, the whole time I watched." I stared at him, goosebumps on the back of my neck. He stared back and seemed so calm, in spite of what he saw. "Son, why didn't you wake us up?" "'Cause it was outside the red line. I could tell it couldn't come past it. And I didn't open the window," he said, as if trying to avoid getting in trouble if he had. But that was beyond my concern at this point. I decided to tell him a version of the truth. I told him the previous owner believed something lived on the property, and that the line was how he kept it back. I said I wasn't sure I believed it yet, but the line seemed to help. I then looked him in the eye and told him I needed him to keep his window closed at night and to stay inside the circle. He nodded. Then he said something that gave me a chill. "Dad, Lily isn't talking to the man who lived here before us. She's talking to that thing that lived here with him." He then went back inside. I knelt in the dirt beside my half-painted section and listened to the wind. Renee told me we were leaving on a Wednesday evening after the kids were in bed. She'd been patient, she explained, for longer than I deserved. She tolerated the smell, the moved objects, the dog's behavior, and my increasing preoccupation with the shed and the notebooks and the perimeter. And despite everything getting better, she'd been watching me go outside at 3 a.m. to touch up a section of the line by torchlight, and she was not happy with that. She'd been standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, watching me kneel in the dirt with a paintbrush and a can of Rust-Oleum. She told me this land had changed me, was turning me into something that wasn't her husband. "We're going to Jin's," she said. Jin was her sister in Odessa. "I'm packing tomorrow." "Renee, this is not what I signed up for, David. You're out there painting the ground at 3 a.m. You spend every evening in that shed reading the diaries of a dead man. I saw the kids talking to the freaking walls. I don't care if it's real or if you've lost your mind, because either way, the kids and I are leaving tomorrow, and you're welcome to join us." I tried to explain. I began to tell her about the notebooks and the line, and what happens if the paint fades. She held up her hand, and I went quiet. She didn't want an explanation, at least not one that sounded insane. She wanted a husband, a normal family, and a normal house, and she was completely justified to want that. She was right, but to me at the time, maintaining that line and choosing family were one and the same. In my head, I took a step back and looked at it. I couldn't argue with how insane I looked, and part of me wanted to leave as well. I wanted to put the house and the shed and the line in the rearview mirror and drive to Odessa to sleep with my wife in Jin's guest room and drink some coffee in a kitchen that smelled like normal kitchen. But another, newer part of me felt like I couldn't do that I had a responsibility to stay here and maintain the red line. If we left, no one would maintain it. I helped her pack. I packed boxes and loaded the truck, and I told myself we would figure it out from Odessa. Maybe we'd sell the place and take the loss. Maybe someone else would find the notebooks and understand. I knew none of this was true, even while I was thinking it, but I kept packing anyway. We would be leaving in the morning, as she had said. That night, I did a final check of the line at sunset. I walked the perimeter, north side fine, east side fine, south side fine. But then I came to the western section. It was completely gone. The paint had been removed from the ground, scraped away in long strips, and I could see the marks in the dirt where something had dragged across the surface. 4 lines, like the scratches on the doors I found before. I repainted it in the dark. I worked with the torch wedged under my chin and the brush shaking in my hand. I laid down the paint, wet and thick. I could feel something watching me the entire time, from outside the circle, from within the scrub. I didn't see it, but I wasn't trying to find it. But it felt like the darkness out past the scrub had pulled into one spot and taken form. Whatever that feeling was coming from, it was only about 15 feet away. It was not moving and not making a sound. It was like a darkness was at the boundary of the new paint, pressing its face into it like glass. I finished and carefully backed toward the house. That gathered darkness stayed where it was. Inside, Renee was holding Lily in the kitchen. The girl had woke up, talking again, louder than usual. Renee had gone in to check on her, only to hear the other half of the conversation through the wall. The voice that came from within the wall. She couldn't make out the words. She described it as a hum, muffled and distant, but certainly words. She was white. Her hands were trembling. She held Lily against her chest, and Lily was now sleeping, completely asleep, breathing steadily. Thank God for the little things. Renee looked at me and said nothing, but she appeared frightened. I think that was the point where she realized her husband had not lost his mind. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. The clock on the stove read 11:42 p.m. The house ticked and settled around us, and that red line outside, freshly painted, held. We left at dawn. The packing was already done. I loaded the last boxes while Renee strapped the kids into the truck, and the dogs jumped into the bed, immediately pressing themselves flat. Even they looked excited to leave. The sun was just clearing the eastern hills, and the thin light hit the house, making it look so deceptively ordinary, just like it looked the first day. But that fresh red circle now looked insane, which it definitely was. I walked back to the front door, and I stood still for a second before pulling it shut. The house sounded quiet. The hallway was visible and empty where I stood, and it ran straight back to the kitchen. Just a hallway, that 31-foot and 4-inch hallway, drywall and carpet. It was almost beautiful. As I said, I pulled the door closed. I locked it, and I went back to my vehicle with my family, and we drove. Renee sat in the passenger seat with her sunglasses on, not talking, just like she had come in when we first arrived. Cody had his headphones on and Lily was still sleeping. The road out of Sanderson goes north through nothing for a long time, before it meets anything you might call civilization. I watched the house in the rearview mirror, getting smaller, shrinking, including the shed behind it, and from there I could not see the red line anymore. Those 40 acres of land I'd wanted since I was a boy in San Antonio, I was leaving it all behind. We went to Jen's in Odessa. She gave us the guest room and the pull-out couch in the den, not asking too many questions. Jen was the kind of person that knows people sometimes show up, and the questions and answers come later. I had my personal laptop. I had contracts to finish. I sat at Jen's dining table and wrote queries and built database schemas, occasionally answering emails. And at night, I lay in the guest bed next to Renee, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the line, wondering whether the paint was still holding, or if the wind had started to cover it with sand again. 3 weeks passed by. The kids were settling in. Cody started a new school and didn't complain. That boy, I swear. He deals with things on his own and so quietly. He comes to his own conclusions when he's ready. Lily played with Jen's cat and did not mention the sad man, and slept through every night. The color came back to Renee's face again before long. She went back to her old self, cooking full meals instead of heating cans. She and Jen sat on the back patio in the evenings, drinking wine and talking about their mother or their jobs. I sat back and watched my family, happy that it was over and that my obsession with the line was slowly fading. Whatever had been in that house, it was not here. Then I got the notification. My Starlink account sent me an alert that the dish was still drawing power. This was expected. We had left in a hurry, and I hadn't disconnected a thing. But the alert prompted me to check the system status remotely, and the system status showed that my work laptop, which I'd left on the desk in the room I'd been using as an office, was still connected and still awake. I'd left it open and I'd left it on the charger. The Starlink was still feeding it a connection. I remoted in from Jen's dining table at 11 o'clock. Everyone else was in bed. The connection was slow but consistent. The laptop screen appeared on my monitor, that familiar desktop and icons. I was able to view the webcam from there, so I did. The room around the laptop was dark. The webcam showed the desk, the chair, the wall behind it. I could see the edge of the doorway to the hall. The house looked the same. I angled the view using the remote desktop cursor, tilting the laptop screen incrementally, trying to get a wider picture. I could see more of the room. The bookshelf, the window, dark. The ceiling fan, which was motionless. A coffee mug I'd apparently left on the desk was still there, undisturbed. My office chair pushed back from the desk at the angle I'd left it. These ordinary things comforted me for about 2 seconds until I saw the doors. Every door I could see was open. The closet in the office, the door to the hallway, and through the hallway door, I could see the bathroom door on the far side also open, and beyond it, the dark rectangle of the linen closet, gaping. The house had peeled itself open again, every cavity exposed, every threshold breached. The hallway was visible through the doorway, a strip of deeper dark beyond the room's darkness. And at the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of what the webcam's tiny lens could resolve, I saw a shape. It was standing in the hallway. It was the approximate size and height of a man, and he was facing the camera, facing the room. It was standing perfectly still, just the way Cody had described. The image resolution was very low and dark, and I could not see much detail. I could see enough to know that the shape did have a head, and that the head was tilted slightly. It could have been a coat on a hook, or a shadow thrown by the hall light filtering through a window from outside. It could have been pareidolia, the brain's compulsion to find faces and bodies in random visual noise. I kept watching it, waiting for something to happen. And for some time, nothing did. But then, suddenly, the shape moved. It shifted its weight, perhaps adjusting its posture. It leaned forward by some small amount. It was looking at the camera now with what I understood, and a part of my brain was recognition. It knew. It knew I was looking at it through the laptop webcam. I shut the laptop hard enough to nearly break the screen, and I kept both hands pressed on it, like something might burst open from within it at any second. I sat at Jen's dining table in the lamplight, looking around at random things. It sort of grounded me, like when you're a kid and your parents let you watch a scary movie, but they have to turn on cartoons afterward. Jen's normal house kept me sane in that moment. From the din, though, through 2 walls and a closed door, I heard Lily's voice. She was on the pull-out couch. She had been asleep for 3 hours until now, because she was talking to someone. Her voice was quiet, but she sounded as if she was responding to someone's words. I heard a small laugh, followed by an, "Okay?" I sat there listening, and the longer it went on, the more I began to tremble. I put my hands flat on the table, staring at the wood. That red, painted circle was calling me now. I felt I had to go back, that I had to drive back to Sanderson, open that shed, read the notebooks again, and ultimately repaint the line, that I would need to repaint it every single morning until the day I died. Then Lily's voice went quiet, and I watched Renee come out of the room Lily was in. I sighed. I had no idea she'd been in there. "You okay?" she asked. I stood up and hugged her so deeply, she was taken aback. "I'm fine." I went to bed with my wife then, and the only thing left on my mind was maybe moving out of Texas for good. Actually, maybe Renee should have the final say this time in where we go next. Haunted houses are scary because sometimes if you stay in them too long, it's not the house that remains haunted, but you and your family end up haunted, no matter where you go next. So be careful whenever you change zip codes. Don't find yourself somewhere with an extra occupant. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Leave Unexplained Encounters a follow and rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. And while you're there, you can find my other podcast if you're in the mood for more scary stories narrated by me. It's called Tales from the Break Room, and it features scary stories that are work-related. By the way, you can read or share your own scary stories over at darkstories.org. Get some EerieCast merch at eeriecast.store. And find me on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. Family secrets are the most tantalizing kind. The people you trust most, and they refuse to let you in on something, but that usually means it's for your own good. That is the case in today's story. An anonymous sender sent this story to me titled Longhead, and oddly enough it reminds me a great deal of my Doghead creepypasta, in a very good way. Maybe I inspired someone, but who knows. Anyway, in this story, a man recalls his time as a young boy after his dad left. His mother moved them in to live with their great-aunt for a while, but during his stay, he begins to grow fearful and suspicious of her stuffed borzoi. This is Unexplained Encounters. I'm Darkness Prevails. Now, let's begin. My great-aunt Julie died last March. She was 96 years old. She lived in a retirement home the last 6 years. By the end of it, she didn't even know my mother's name, her own niece, and that really messed with my mother. I flew back for the service, and I stayed a week to help clean out her house. I was one of the unlucky ones who didn't have kids or a family, so I was always at the call when the family needed something. So I get volunteered for things a lot. Her house is actually where we lived from 1996 to 1999. Me, my mother, and my 2 sisters. I'm here today to tell you about those 3 creepy and weird years, and I'm not sure you're gonna believe all of it. So, my father left in the spring of 1996. All I remember back then was that my father left for work that day, and he just didn't come back. He did call 11 days later from Jacksonville, and probably for my sake and my sister's sakes, that's all my mother ever said. Of course, with the main earner gone, we soon lost our home in town. My mother, you can call her Charlene, had been working part-time at a doctor's office. She had to pick up more hours and it wasn't nearly enough. So she did what she had to do. She didn't want to do it, but she sucked it up anyway. She called her aunt. Julie was my grandmother's older sister. She was 70 years old at the time, so old then, right? And by then she had been a widow for 15 years. All those years she lived alone on 11 acres. About 20 minutes outside of town or so she had nobody to talk to, but she did have a phone on the kitchen wall that she liked to use, and the cord on that thing could reach around the entire house probably twice over. Julie said yes. She seemed almost excited about it from what I heard on the phone. My mother looked so relieved. Julie didn't even ask how long we needed, or about money either. She said, according to my mother, "Come on, I've got more house than sense." That's the kind of person Julie was. And despite her eccentricities, I loved her for that. Before I knew it, we were turning off the road onto a dirt track with pecan trees planted down both sides. And the trees had not been tended to, apparently, since, I would learn, the 60s. So they had grown into each other overhead, and you could drive the last stretch in shade. When the track finally opens up, there's her house. It was a white clapboard house, 2 stories, with a porch running the whole front and around the east side. Her late husband's, Earl's, grandfather, put it up sometime around 1910, and someone in the family had lived in the place ever since. Out back was a barn that had been vacant of animals for decades. There was a well house too, and a burn barrel. Beyond that was the woods and a fence line, then more of the same for a good half-mile before you hit the neighbor's place. Inside her house, it was very clean, and yet worn out at the same time. The wallpaper was turning yellow in spots. She had a window unit in the front bedroom, and box fans everywhere else, at least a dozen of the dang things. I remember the first time I tasted water at her house. Well water, and it tasted like a dirty penny. She had 4 bedrooms upstairs. Julie put my sisters in one room, and me in another. My mother got the 3rd, while Julie kept sleeping downstairs in the little room off the kitchen, like she always had. Allow me to introduce my sisters. Tessa was 14 when we moved in, and I gotta say there's no worse age to get relocated 9 miles from everybody you once knew. She spent the first half year acting like she'd been sentenced. Nell was 5, so she thought the whole thing was a big vacation. I was in between, at 9 years old. I need to explain the front room now. The house had a front room off the entry hallway that nobody used. Every old house down there had one of these rooms. It was the room with the good furniture and the china cabinet. It was covered in framed photos, and it seemed to exist just to be looked at. You might sit in it twice a year when the preacher came over or something like that, but most of the time it stayed shut. Whenever I was in that room, or near the doorway when the door was opened, it smelled of dust and cedar. I would soon discover that standing in that room on a low wooden base about 6 inches off the floor, in front of the window that looked out at the front yard, was Joyce. Joyce was the name of Aunt Julie's Borzoi. Borzoi are quite the breed. They're the tall Russian dogs, wolfhounds and sighthounds, big dogs that get to 70 or 80 pounds, but they're built really narrow. They look like someone stretched out a normal dog long ways. They have deep chests and waists you could almost put your hands around, but legs like a table. And the head is the craziest part. A Borzoi's head is long and narrow, and from the ears to the nose it's almost completely straight, with only a slight curve down at the end. The whole skull is basically one long shape. Julie got Joyce as a puppy in 1968, and she passed away in 1974, so Julie had her mounted. She talked about the real dog sometimes. She said that Joyce would run down a rabbit in an open field, then not even want it once she caught it. She said the dog would sleep on the porch in the sun, like she had been poured out onto the porch instead of laying on it. Earl was still alive then, and the two of them never had their own children. I've always kind of figured that dog occupied a spot in her life that was meant for a child. So I understood the impulse to have it mounted. Even though I would never do it myself, I sort of get it. People have their dogs taxidermied. It's not common, but not unheard of, and out where we were in 1974, you didn't have specialists. You would instead have some dude who did deer usually. So that's who she used. Apparently, it was the first guy she could find within 100 miles who could mount white-tailed deers for hunters. He had never in his life done a dog, though, and you could tell when you looked at Joyce. There was a lot of wrongness to the way Joyce looked. It was more like 100 small portions of the poor dog's skin were placed and stretched to where they should be. And every time I saw someone new see that dog for the first time, you could see it in their eyes and expression. That I nearly jumped startled look. The coat, though, was fine. It was really long and silky still, with white and tan patches over the shoulders, and one across the hip. From across the room in dim light, with the fur laying just right, it almost looked like a dog standing in a window. But take one step and you'd see that the whole shape was disturbing. I always told myself it looked so weird, because to me it looked like a deer man had built a deer body, then remembered, oh yeah, this is for a dog. Deer are thick where a Borzoi is thin. There was too much space in the chest, and not enough space in the flank, as if he had compensated. So poor old Joyce had this heavy front end and a back half that was almost caved in. The legs were also too straight. Dogs don't stand with all 4 legs like straight-up posts. They stand a little uneven. But that thing stood like a sawhorse. To my sister Tessa, the eyes were horrifying. They were glass and round eyes, but a Borzoi's eyes, any dog's eyes, are not perfectly round things. They're not perfect little marbles. They're at a slant and a little sunken. But these sat out too far, and they caught the light from the hallway, making it almost look like they were following you as you walked. And for my sister Nell, the mouth was the worst. The guy had sewed the lip up a hair short on the left side, so about a 1/4 inch of tooth showed, just enough that if you were 5 years old, you would think it was smiling at you. To me, I absolutely hated the seam. There was a seam all the way around the neck. It wasn't accidental, it was on purpose. A seam right down where the neck met the shoulders, going all the way around like a carved-in collar. The fur had been parted along it in a clean line, and if you got up close to it and looked real good, you could see the stitching in there. Heavy dark thread, more like the kind of stuff you'd find on a boot, rather than a body. One day when Julie was in the kitchen, I went up to her. "Why does Joyce have a line around her neck?" I asked. "Well, that's just how they decided to do it," she said, without even looking at me. "But why all the way around?" I asked. "You little weasel." That's what she liked to call me. My name is Wesley, and she always called me Weasel. "You ask 100 questions a day, and I've got things to do." I was sort of satisfied with her answer and walked away. I understood adults would explain things wrong or in lies or partial lies just to get kids to leave them alone or to get them away from answers they weren't ready for. Like when a kid comes up and asks, "How are babies made?" But that didn't keep me from having my own theory at the time. Instead, I was thinking you stitch stuff to keep it in place. So Joyce's stitches around her neck were to keep her head on. So did Joyce's head come off? Julie had rules for her house. Just a few. She let us know about them the first week. Don't touch the dog. Rule number 1. You could go in the front room, nobody said you couldn't, but you did not put your hands on old Joyce. Julie dusted Joyce herself once a week, and she said she would know if Joyce had been touched. Number 2. When it gets dark, come back inside. That's not a strange one at all. That's a normal rule for a woman who is already too old to be handling kids, and didn't want kids unfamiliar with the woods to go exploring woods and getting lost. My mother gave us the same rule before we even got there. Number 3. The back door stays unlatched. That one was weird to me. There was a hook and an eye on the kitchen door to the back steps. Julie never used it. I never saw her use it, at least. And she didn't want it to be used. Tessa latched it one night in October, sort of automatically. She was a 14-year-old girl and had watched a scary movie. Later, Julie came by and unhooked it, and in the morning, without any heat at all, she said, "Hon, please don't latch that door, okay?" My mother asked, "Julie, what's with that door?" And Julie, her reply, if I remember correctly, was something like, if someone wants in a house, they'd get in a house and a hook wasn't going to do anything but cost you a door. That sounded like paranoia or pessimism to me. Or maybe it's just something an old country woman would say. Then there was the last rule. If you hear walking at night, stay in bed. She explained she didn't sleep very good these days, so she would get up and move around. She didn't want 4 people coming out in the hallway concerned every time we heard her walking about. Made sense to me. Turns out, though, there was walking every single night. It wasn't most nights or some nights. Every night we lived in that house, I heard walking. It started somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and it would go on for hours. It was a light and steady walk, like someone pacing when they're mid-thought. It went up the hall and it came back down the hall. Then it went up to the front of the house and came back. Then it would do that again and again. There was no getting a drink pause in it, no resting, no toilet break. Imagine steady, constant walking while you're trying to fall back to sleep. I swear, sometimes when I woke up around 5, it was still going. It was quiet steps too, like tiptoe light, which to me sounded like my Aunt Julie just being polite, doing her usual walking, but now that she had guests, she was softening up her steps. Yeah, it all made sense to us kids. Old women can't sleep too good, everybody knows that. And we had a comparison because my grandmother didn't sleep very well either. She sometimes called my mother at 5 in the morning to talk about a coupon. So when we heard the walking, what we heard was Aunt Julie, up again, poor thing, wandering around the house in the dark because her body just wouldn't let her rest. Tessa used to do an impression of it. She'd creep around the upstairs hall on her toes with her arms out. She was funny. Nell would just about die laughing. I didn't really put 2 and 2 together until much later in my life. But Julie, being 70 years old, then 71 and 72 while we were there, she had a bad hip since day 1, and we would watch her use the rail on the stairs when she went up and down, taking them one at a time. And that did not properly match up to a walking sound each and every night that would go on unstopped for 4 or 5 hours, without a slowdown or hitch over those years, despite Aunt Julie getting older. No, Julie could not have made those steps, let alone do it for 20 minutes. Our time at Aunt Julie's was pretty good, though. We were broke, and my mother cried in the car sometimes. I know she thought we couldn't see her, but we could. But we were still doing better than good. That house had a porch you could sit on all evening, and a big yard with no neighbors in it. The pecans from the trees you could go pick up and crack with a brick. Julie even taught me to shell butter beans and shuck corn. Then she had me pushing the mower to mow the lawn. She taught Nell all sorts of card games, but never once let her win. My mother thought that was unfair, and Nell to this day says that is why she's so competitive. She and Tessa fought like cats for about a year, then somewhere along the line, they became something close to best friends. And by the end, Tessa was the one who'd sit up with her at the kitchen table. But Aunt Julie, she teased me constantly. That was her love language. "Weasel, get your feet off my chair. Weasel, you've got a head like a mailbox." If I ever came home with a haircut, she would let me hear about it for the next week. When I got glasses in 4th grade, she looked at me and said, "Well, now you look like somebody who knows a thing or two." Thanks, Aunt Julie. Her sister, my grandmother, came out most Sundays, and the two of them would sit on the porch talking for hours about people and stuff. A lot of people who had been dead for decades. My mother would come out too, getting pulled into it. She was not a spooky old woman in a spooky old house. In stories like this one, the aunt is always some hollowed-eyed crone, muttering at the walls. But Julie watched Wheel of Fortune. She had opinions about the church organist, and she drove a brown Oldsmobile 8 miles an hour under the limit, with both hands on the wheel. The only thing about Aunt Julie was not Aunt Julie herself. It was that darned dog she kept in the house. Aunt Julie would dust Joyce every Saturday. I saw her do it a few times. She would take a soft rag and she'd go in there, and she'd wipe down the whole thing. Top of the head, down the back, each leg. She'd be done in about 90 seconds. Pretty fast. Faster than I would expect from a woman who was so protective of that dog. Not to mention, nothing Julie did was fast. She also held her breath. It reminded me of when I had to take out my little sister's diaper pail, back when she was still in diapers. Right before I opened that nasty thing, I would hold my breath, open it, and pull out the bag and tie it as fast as I could, trying not to pass out from holding my breath too long. It was a race to get it done. And that's what Julie acted like. She'd take a breath at the door of that room, and she'd hold it the entire time almost, as she wiped away at that dog to dust it. Sometimes I'd hear her come back out in the hallway and take in a big breath of air, or release a big one that she'd been holding in. Another thing is she never talked to Joyce. Maybe that's weird, maybe it's not, but I figured I would bring it up. Aunt Julie was quite the talker. She would talk to her car, the pecan trees even, to a jar of pickles that wouldn't open. She said good morning to Earl's picture in the hall every day of her life. But every time I saw her wipe down that dog, not a single word was spoken. One time I heard her say something in that room, though. I'd come downstairs for water, and she was in the doorway of the front room. Her back was to me. She wasn't going into the room, just standing in the doorway, in the dark, and it looked like she was looking at Joyce. Then I heard her say in a low voice, like talking to a dog that was still alive, "Go on now." Then she saw me standing there and told me to get my water and go on back to bed. This kid named Dewey came to visit us in the summer one time. Dewey was the son of the nearest neighbor to Aunt Julie, just about a half-mile through that pine forest, or a full mile if he went around by the road. Dewey was my age, maybe a year older. We'd been in the same class for 2 years, and yet this was the first time he ever came out to the house. His mother had dropped him off. He was weird about it from the second he got out of the car. He kept looking at the house, like it was going to pounce on him, and he would not go in through the front door. He would only go into the house if it was through the kitchen with me. Once we were up in my room on a hot day enjoying the box fan, and he said to me, "You know what people say about this house?" No. They say something about this place?" He nodded. He said, "This is the haunted one." "That sounds stupid," I told him. "Nuh-uh, everyone knows this house is haunted." Then I told him, "Well, I live here, and nobody told me." He rolled his eyes and replied, "Well, they're not going to say it to you, because you live here. That would be, like, rude." Then I said it again. "That's stupid." He smiled smugly. "Well, a man hung himself in that barn out there." "No, he did not." "Did too. My cousin told me." "When did it happen?" "I don't know when. A long time ago. And there's a baby buried out in them pecan trees out there." I actually laughed. "There's not a baby buried out there." "Uh-huh. If you went out with a shovel, you'd find it." I then explained how I knew it wasn't true, because every legend like that has its own baby buried in the lawn somewhere. The place we lived at before had its own dead baby legend, and I wasn't about to believe another one. Dewey then said, "Okay, well, My daddy won't even drive past y'all's road at night. Why? He just won't. He goes all the way around instead. That's 4 extra miles, and he does it every time. Did you ever ask him why he does that? Yeah, one time. I waited. Well, what did he say? Oh, he said that's just the way we go. Dewey, that doesn't mean anything. I laid my head down in my arms, getting a little bit annoyed. Well, what about this? He said. I looked up at him with one eye. Have you ever seen The Stick Man? Now he had my attention. I've heard plenty of ghost stories and boogeymen, but not The Stick Man. No, never heard of that, unless you mean like drawing it on paper. No, I don't mean the thing you draw on paper. I saw it once. You know where the fence line is along the field out there? I was out there one day, and it was getting dark. And I swear I saw something out there on our side of the fence. It was standing in the grass. What it looked like? It was standing like a person, and it... So it was just a person. No, let me finish. It wasn't a person. But it looked like it was made out of sticks, like the legs were sticks. A whole bunch of them bunched up together. Like this. He put his fingers together in a bundle and squeezed them tight. And it was just walking. Oh, what did it do? Did it go anywhere? It walked across the field, and it went fast. And it walked like some guy on stilts. Well, how big was it? Taller than a grown man. I suddenly felt a heat in my chest and face, like an irritation. I realized now what I was feeling. My Aunt Julie's house had become our home, and now some neighbor kid had the gall to come over here and tell me that our place was the bad haunted place with a monster on it. You're crazy, I told him. It was probably just a deer. It wasn't a deer. Well, you said it was getting dark, and it was way out in the field. If you saw a big buck far away in some tall grass at night, it'll probably look like anything you want it to look like. My uncle says people sight Bigfoot every year, and it's always just a deer standing funny. That was a lie, actually. I did not have an uncle who said that. I'd only heard someone say that at some tire shop. Dewey shook his head. Whatever, he said. I could tell he didn't want to keep arguing about it. We went and played some Nintendo for a few hours. Then his mother came and picked him up. Dewey never came back to that house again as long as I knew him. But I never asked him to come out either. But I remembered what he said for all time. He said it was tall as a man, maybe taller. Maybe it was a dude on stilts. Maybe he had mistaken a tree for something more alive. But I didn't let Dewey's story scare me, even though I probably should have. After my encounter with Dewey and his story, I became more perceptive and cautious about Aunt Julie's place. To be honest, his story did creep me out a little bit, and I was a bit on edge for a few days after. During that time, I did notice some things. Even though Aunt Julie dusted down Joyce every Saturday, the front room itself was only swept about once a month, if that. But one time when I went in there, I noticed a little bit of stuff at the base of where Joyce stood. A little sand and grit, red clay, dried into flakes. And the day after that, I found pine straw, just a little bit, like 3 or 4 brown needles, just on the floor there. But they weren't anywhere else. Now, how could that be? A room that almost everybody avoided or didn't go in that much. How could it have been tracked in here, but only in one spot, by the base of the thing we weren't allowed to touch? Very weird, I thought. Now remember I said that room always smelled like dust and cedar. But I noticed there were some mornings, always mornings, where you could walk past that door and get a whole different scent, and it would smell briefly like the outside, like wet or dewy ground, smelled like freshly rained on dirt. After these 2 noticings, I made up my mind about breaking Aunt Julie's rule. I put my hand on Joyce. Yeah, I know I'd been told explicitly not to do that for years now. But I remember it was a Saturday morning. Mom took my sisters into town, so the house was empty. I went in that room specifically to break that rule. It likely didn't help that I was at a rebellious age. I put my hand flat on her shoulder. Her fur was damp, like it wasn't recently wet, but wet an hour ago. It was cool and heavy in the fur. When I pulled my hand away, there was a smear of that red clay across my palm. When I had her alone, I told Tessa about it. Nobody else. Tessa was 16 by then, and had gotten to where she talked to me like a person at long last, but only half the time. I expected her to laugh at me, but she said instead, "Okay, weird question for you. What is it?" When Aunt Julie walks around at night, have you ever seen a light come on, under the door or in the hallway, coming up from downstairs? I thought about it, and she was right. No, actually. Her eyes got wide. Exactly. If an old lady is walking around the house in pitch darkness, she would turn on a light, not risk breaking a hip. But no, we never see a light come on. But why? We sat there for a minute. Tessa eventually came up with an idea. Maybe she's lived here long enough that she knows the place like the back of her hand. She's got like old person's echolocation. She doesn't need a light. Maybe. I smiled for a quick second, then said, Yeah, that's it. The spring of 1999, my mother had started talking about a place in town, a rental on the north side. There was a real feeling then that we might be living in a new place come summer. But with spring, there was cleaning we had to do. Always spring cleaning. Julie sent me up in the attic to bring down boxes of Christmas things. I went up there with a flashlight, as the bulb was out, and I was up for a good half hour, going through junk that had not been moved or touched in probably 30 years. I found some things up there, like a wooden base, which was about the size of a doormat, dark stained oak with a beveled edge. It took me a second to realize it was the exact same kind of base that Joyce stood on downstairs. It was the same kind of wood and bevel, same everything. It had 4 little holes in the top of it where the legs of something had been bolted through, and the holes were not where a dog's legs would go. They were closer together than that, more square. I looked at it with a flashlight in my mouth, just wondering why it would be up here, why there was another one. Then I put it back where I found it. Then I found the other thing, which was a photograph. It was in a shoebox of loose pictures, and that was the single most upsetting object I've ever held in my hands. The photo was in black and white, with a white scalloped border. The photo showed the front room of Aunt Julie's house, taken from the doorway. Same window and wallpaper and all that, but darker and newer looking. There was different furniture in there. A woman sat in a chair on the left side of the frame, older and in a dress with little round glasses. She was looking straight at the camera. I didn't know her, and that threw me off for a second, because everything else in that attic was ours, our family's. But Julie married into that house. It was Earl's family that built it and Earl's family that lived in it, so that woman must have been one of them, which made her nothing to me at all. And on the right side of that frame, in front of the window on a low, dark base, there was a mounted animal. But it wasn't a dog. It was smaller, low and long, and it had a narrow head with a pointed nose, ears perked up. A fox, I thought. Probably. Something like a fox. The picture wasn't good enough to swear by it, and the flash had blown out most of the detail on the white parts of the creature. But I could see the base, and I could tell it was the same kind. And I noticed, right where the neck met the shoulders on that weird animal, there was a line all the way around it. A seam. Quietly, I put the shoebox back, and I brought down the Christmas boxes, and I remember Julie making me a sandwich. 2 weeks after that, I saw it. The window in my room faced the front of the house and looked down over the yard and the pecan track. It was too hot, and the box fan wasn't doing anything, so I had the window all the way up. That night, or very early in the morning, I woke up around 2, sweating and annoyed that I was awake. After rubbing my eyes and sitting up, I realized how quiet the house was. Remember, for 3 years now, every night, I'd been hearing those footsteps. Other kids might fall asleep to a highway, but I fell asleep to that. I lay there in the dark, genuinely now bothered by this quietness. It would be like the ticking of a clock just stopping in a silent class. I got out of bed, and I went to the window for some air. As I did, I looked out to the yard. There was something down there. Whatever it was out past the big pecan, about 60 feet from the house. It was standing still in the grass. There was a decent moon that night. Not full, but enough that I could see, and it gave the yard a pale blue shimmer. Whatever it was, it appeared to be about 6 feet tall. And it was thin, incredibly thin. The legs were not legs. They appeared more like bundles, tight groupings of long thin pieces, held together somehow, 4 or 5 to a limb. And where they came together at the top, there was a body that was hardly a body at all. Just more of the same bundled things together. On top of it, there was a head. A long head. Even at 60 feet, in that pale light, even with me not wearing my glasses at the moment, it was long and narrow, running straight from the ears to the nose, and I knew what it was I was looking at. Joyce's head. And its head turned on that stack of sticks body, as smooth as a person turning around to look at a sound they'd heard. And it looked up at the house. I don't think it was looking at me, but at the house in general. I then watched it walk. Dewey had been right about that part. It went off toward the side yard, and it did not walk like an animal or a man. It walked like a man on stilts, who had gotten beyond good at it. Every step went too far, and it never wobbled a single time. And as it walked, it never made a single sound. It crossed 15 yards of dry grass in June in Georgia, and there wasn't so much as a rustle. Nothing at all. I stood at the window until it went around the corner of the house where I could no longer see it. About a minute later, I heard the walking start up downstairs. Goosebumps covered my entire body in the matter of 3 seconds. I'm not sure how long I stood there at the window, but eventually I got back in bed, treading more quietly than I ever had before. I laid on my side facing the door with my eyes open until light. I didn't do anything about it for 7 weeks. I've heard people say they don't understand how a person can know a thing or see a thing like that and just go on eating cereal and bacon for breakfast. But now that I had gone through it, I understood it just fine. You have to be normal. And the more normal you can go through, the more you can stack up and tell yourself that what you saw wasn't real, or at least you can forget it. School let out. We swam at Dewey's Pond, which is funny to me now. My mother got approved for the rental, and we were set to move come August. Nell turned 8, and we had a cake on the porch, and Jolie made her this cool paper crown. But then that thought would come, that image of what I saw that night, around 2 in the afternoon, or randomly in the morning, or flooding me underneath my closed eyes in the middle of the night, keeping me awake. And I'd lie there listening to something walking up the hall and back down, something that I was now so very sure was not my Aunt Julie. I started checking the front room. Not every day, but I'd stop in the doorway on my way through, and I would look at Joyce standing there in the window, light coming in on her disgusting neck. I'd look at that seam, then I'd go about my business. Then I got, well, the best word for this is, insulted. I was 12 years old, and I was mad. Mad that something was walking around the house every single night, and mad that Dewey's dad went 4 miles out of his way to avoid our land. And upset that my aunt let something have the run of the place, let something make the rules about it, and wouldn't say what they were for. I was mad that I was leaving in a month, and nobody was ever going to say one true word to me about any of this crap. I wanted to see it, in the light, up close with the door shut behind me. I wanted to hold the proof of it in my 2 hands and know it wasn't a nightmare. That's all it was, and it was never a good reason to do what I did. This happened the last week of July. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. I lay there awake for a while, listening for sounds around the house. I had made a habit of listening for where that thing had gotten off to inside. It was down at the far end now, way off. You could hear it going along the back hall by that little room off the kitchen where Julie slept. I got up, making sure not to make much noise. I didn't have a plan. A goal, but not a plan. I got out of bed in a t-shirt and gym shorts, no shoes, and I walked slowly down the stairs in the dark on the outsides of my feet to keep quiet. Every single step I took, I was telling myself in my head, just look, just take a peek. I found the front room door open. At night, unless Julie was standing in the doorway to that room, she never left the door open. After dark, it sat shut always. I stood in that hall for a while looking at a dark rectangle where that door should have been closed. I could smell the outside, that wet ground smell I told you about. I went in, and I turned on the light to the front room. Joyce was on her base, all four legs, same as usual. But there was nothing on top of her neck. Just the ring, a clean dark circle where her head was supposed to be, about 3 inches across, with the stitching pulled open all the way around and the ends of the thread hanging loose. Inside it was hollow, dark, and dry, with nothing in it, an empty wooden chamber. I stared for a moment, my hand still on the light switch, and then I did the stupidest thing I have ever done in my life. I picked up Joyce's body, and I took her with me. I put both arms around that body and picked it up off the base. It was light. I should have known it would be when I learned it was hollow. And then I started for the kitchen. My plan now, if you want to call it that, had assembled itself in a matter of seconds. I was going to put her out on the back step, outside, where anybody could see her in the morning, where my mother and Tessa and Nell and Aunt Julie would all have to come out that kitchen door and look at a headless dog standing in the yard. Somebody would finally have to say something out loud about it. I wanted a grown adult to have to admit something, because everything was just too weird. I got 4 steps into the hall, and the footsteps changed. The walking, which had been way off down the back hall, going along at its same steady pace it had gone for 3 years, was now going at a different speed. It wasn't loud, it never was. It went from a walk to something with a lot more steps in it. Quick and light, the usual footsteps I'd heard. They went tick, 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 tick. But what I heard that night was a tick, 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 and it was coming up the back hall toward the kitchen, and coming fast. I've never moved so quick in my life, and I've never been so slow. I got to the kitchen door with that thing in my arms, and I could hear her in the back hall, 10 feet beyond the other side of that wall, coming. I hit the doorway, and I made it maybe 3 steps across the kitchen floor when I dropped Joyce's body. She hit the linoleum on her side, sliding then stopping against the leg of the table. I ran for the pantry. The pantry was on the left side of the kitchen. It had been a canning room once, so it was deep and narrow, 4 feet wide and 8 feet back, with shelves up both sides full of mason jars and a bare bulb on a pull chain. It had a real door, a solid one. It had been built to hold the cold in, but there was no lock. There was never a lock in that door. It was a food closet, but it opened inward. I got in, and I got the door shut as quick as I could. I then sat down on the floor with my back to the door. My feet were up on the bottom shelf across from me, and I pushed, and I pushed. 4 feet is about right for a 12-year-old to do that. If it was any further away, I could not have reached it. Thank God for those 4 feet. That's when something blocked out the light from the crack under the door. It hit the door. There was a scrabble, a fast, dry scratching sound high up on both sides. It sounded like a dog wanting in, except a dog has paw pads. But this thing had nothing but points. It was the sound of a handful of sticks dragging down a door over and over, raking against it. This happened for some time. When it stopped, something went down to the bottom of the door. There was a gap under that door of maybe 1.5 inches. An older house, so a bigger gap. The first one came in right beside my hip. A long, thin piece of brown, big around as a pencil. It came out from under that door, slow and feeling around like an antenna, side to side. A big wooden finger going along a wall for a light switch. It swept across the floor, touching the side of my leg through my shorts, and I wanted to scream when I felt it. I didn't move. I just kept pushing. I could not get away from it. If I tried to get further away from it, it would come through the door. The second I took my back off that door was when that door would come open, and that creature would come in and get me. So I dug my heels in harder, my legs shaking, and I let it touch me. More of them came, 4 or 5 of them, feeling around on both sides of me. They went across the floor and back until one of them found my hand where it was flat on the boards. It went over the top of my hand and kept going. I remember thinking it felt like a broom straw. But unlike sticks or branches, these weren't exactly stiff. They bent where they pleased, as if they had joints wherever they needed. After several minutes of this, they all pulled back at once, and everything went quiet. A moment later, I heard something settle down on the floor out there. That's when it put its head down sideways to look under the door. You could fit a Borzoi's head pretty far under an 1.5 inch gap like that. And so it did. It turned its head sideways and pushed as far as it would go. I could see about 1/3 of it reaching through. The bulb was on over my head in that pantry, so I saw it clearly. The long head sideways on the floor, and one single round glass deer eye looking straight at me. It didn't blink. I don't think it even could. And unlike a snarling and sniffing dog, it saw me and stopped. It just sat there on its side, only about 2 feet from my own face, and it stared at me. This part I can't tell you for sure how long it lasted. Could have been 10 minutes. The scratching and the reaching and the eye thing. It happened so fast. The head pulled away so suddenly that I got startled, and something got up off the floor. Footsteps went out of the kitchen. Tick, tick, tick. And after a moment, I heard the back door smack the frame. Somebody had walked out. The house then went quiet. I did not take my back off that door. My legs were cramping up something fierce, but I kept them exactly where they were. At some point I had to let just one rest, so I did that, and when the other began to give out, I'd switch them. I stayed back to that door until I saw light coming through the crack, and that last hour I was in there, I cried. It started as scared crying and turned into confused crying, and eventually that was just crying that loops in on itself, like a little kid does. They cry and eventually they just keep crying because of the momentum of it. And I'm not ashamed to say that I soiled myself. I never once thought about opening that door, though, no matter how desperately I wanted to run for my mom. Not one time. 20 feet of hallway and a staircase, it never entered my head as an option, because what was in my head was the idea that it was out there, waiting for me to walk out that door, waiting for me to let my guard down. The bulb remained on the whole night. There were a few moments I was terrified at the idea that it might go out, but it didn't. I didn't pull the chain. I'd have sat there with that light on until I died before I made that room go dark. At some point after it got full light out, Jolie tried the pantry door. It moved about 1 inch and stopped against my back. I felt it and nearly screamed, thinking it was something else. I didn't move, and I kept pushing. She tried again, then said, "Wesley?" She didn't call me Weasel. I swear the whole 3 years we were in that house, I don't think that woman called me Wesley again one time. I got off the floor, and I got out of the way. The door came open. Julie was dressed with her hair done and shoes on, at 6 a.m. for some reason. She looked at me, and I probably looked a mess. I recall barely being able to stand. My legs were trembling so badly. I expected her to gasp or something, but she didn't. She didn't even look surprised. She looked me over for about 2 seconds, then at the floor at the bottom of the door. There were scratches on the outside, and a wet spot where I'd been sitting. Rather than being scared, concerned, furious, one of the emotions I expected to see come from her, they didn't. What I saw was heartbreak go across her face. She reached out a hand and said, "Come here, Weasel." Joyce was back in the front room, standing on her base in the window with her head on. I think Aunt Julie must have done that before she came to find me. Sometime between it leaving me at the pantry and her opening that pantry door, my 73-year-old aunt with a bad hip carried that body back down the hall and set it back on the bolts where it belonged. Now, the process of her getting the head back where it goes, I couldn't begin to tell you how that went. I sat at the kitchen table. She gave me a glass of milk, but my stomach hurt too much to drink. "What did you do?" she asked. I touched her. It was a while back. I put my hand on her, and I found out she was wet." I waited for a moment to see if she would say something, but she didn't. "And Aunt Julie, I saw it. Out the window one night. It was out by the big pecan. It was standing there, and it went off around the side of the house. I didn't tell nobody. I didn't tell Mama. I swear I didn't tell anyone." "All right, settle down." "And there's a picture in the attic." That one made one of her eyebrows raise up. "In the shoebox. It showed this room, the front room. And there's a lady sitting in the chair, and there's something standing on a base just like Joyce, but it's not Joyce. It's different. A littler one, with a pointy nose. But it's got the same line around its neck." "That was a fox," she said. I sat there and went quiet. Then I confessed. I was going to put her out in the yard," I said. "When she got up to walk, I went to get her to put her in the yard." "Where she couldn't get back to herself?" "Yes, ma'am." I started to say sorry, but she put her hand up. "I'm not fussing at you. You didn't know about any of this. This is on me. I ought to have told you, but I didn't. I never in my life figured out how to say it to somebody without sounding like I needed to be thrown in a home." "So, what is it?" "I don't know." "Aunt Julie." "Weasel, I've been in this house 51 years and I do not know. Don't sit there and look at me like I'm keeping it from you." "Well, where'd it come from?" "It was here when we got married." She cleared her throat. "Earl's mother kept it. His grandmother before her. I never asked past that, and I didn't want to know past that. If you're fixing to ask me why, it's because there's no end to that road." "So, Uncle Earl knew about it?" She nodded. "And he still lived here?" "Well, he was born here," she said. "What does it want?" "Not much. It wants let out, to be left alone, and it wants kept nice. You gotta keep her dusted, and you leave that back door off the hook so it can go outside. But you never put your hands on her. Treat her right, and she'll walk her rounds, and she won't bother a soul." "That's it?" "That's it, 4 years at a time." I didn't like the sound of that. "What do you mean? What about the rest of the time?" "It'll take what it needs when it needs it, and you don't get any say. All you get a say in is whether you're decent about it after." "Aunt Julie, I don't know what that means." "No, you don't, and you don't need to." She got up. It means Joyce was 6 years old and healthy in 1974. Then she took the milk I hadn't touched and poured it in the sink. She said we needed to get the mower out and get the yard mowed before it got too hot. That is every word my great Aunt Julie ever said to me about it, and now I'm telling it to you. She never brought it up again for as long as I knew her, and I never dared to ask her another thing. We moved to that rental house, just as planned. Life went back to normal as life without a dad could be. My mom went to her grave just 2 years ago, and I never did tell her. This next part might be funny. You might think I was scared of my Aunt Julie's place, or even of her after what happened to me. But no, we met up at her place several times a year for Christmases, Thanksgiving, and all that. It was fun and wholesome as it should be, and she was always her old self. The only change would be that I never, ever dared set foot in that front room. But Aunt Julie started to slip around 2012. She forgot names first, then the rest of it. By 2019, we couldn't keep her out there, so she went to a home over in town. My mother sold the house that fall to a family from out of state who were tickled to death to get 11 acres at that price. Julie had a bad time at dusk. That's common, they told us. Around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, she would get agitated and want to go home, no idea where she was, and that kept happening every day until she couldn't talk anymore. But before that time came, she would often get a hold of your wrist and ask you, "Did you let the dog out?" The nurses thought it was the sweetest thing in the world. They would say, "Oh yes, ma'am, don't worry about it. The dog's been let out." And she would settle right down. One of them mentioned to my mother that she pictured Julie as a young woman with a big, beautiful dog running in a field. My mother said thank you, and that was right. But all I could do was just stare at the floor. There was one time she grabbed my wrists, and when she did, she didn't even look at me. She looked at the window nearby, and what she said was, "Longhead's out. Somebody's got to let Longhead back in." After Aunt Julie passed, at some point I asked my mother, what happened to Joyce? Mom said it went with the house. The buyers had even asked about it, actually. Thought it was some period piece. Asked if it conveyed. So they got it. It's still standing in that window now. It's been decades as of writing this. I drove out there not too long ago, just to take a look and pass by. I slowed at the end of the track, and I looked. The pecan trees had been cut back, and there was a swing set in the yard. There was also a dog in the yard, some kind of German Shepherd mix. It was big and young, running along the fence, chasing something. Then I pulled away, and I drove home. I'm a big fan of this story. There's something so cozy yet disturbing about it at the same time. If I was the type to listen to my own stuff, this would be one of the stories I come back to on a rainy day. Let me ask you all this. Would you like your own Longhead? Which breed would you prefer? And would you make sure to take care of it? Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on X at Dark Prevails for announcements and other cool stuff. Send me your own stories of the unexplained over at darkstories.org. Support the show and what I do by going to erie.fm/premium and sign up to be a premium member to unlock audiobooks, bonus stories, and much more, plus no ads on any of your favorite EerieCast shows. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. Do you mind if I spend a second being open and honest with you all before we start? YouTube is currently demonetizing horror podcasts and narration across the platform. I know it's only a matter of time before they hit us. That would mean half of our revenue gone overnight, including up to 2 months of unpaid earnings that we will never get. I'm telling you this because we need your help. The only way EerieCast can be safe from financial calamities like this is with your help. So please, consider going to erie.fm, our brand new feature-filled website, and sign up for premium membership for just $8 a month or $70 a year. You'll unlock access to bonus episodes of your favorite shows, exclusive audiobooks and ebooks, members-only series, and you'll never have to listen to another ad on any EerieCast episode for as long as you're subscribed. Help us become independent of platforms that treat creators such as me like we are disposable. Again, that's EERIE.FM. Eerie.fm. Thank you so very much. Now then, I'll make this intro quick. Today I've prepared an assortment of allegedly true and terrifying stories from folks in Appalachia, dwellers of haunted homes, and people who wished they'd never seen what they saw. This is Unexplained Encounters. I'm Darkness Prevails. And now, let's begin. Nobody here knows that name. From Adelaida. I'm posting this from England, so if I use some slang, sorry. In the summer of 2019, me, my parents, my little sister, and 3 of my friends went to my late grandparents' house, who had sadly died the summer before due to old age, which makes sense because they were pretty old. My family is originally from the south of England, but moved here when I was 7. My parents had decided to keep their cottage out in the woods of Virginia. I was glad they kept the cottage, as me and my sisters had basically grown up here. We came here every summer since we were 7. As I've gotten older, the cottage had begun to give me not necessarily a weird vibe, but there was something off-putting about the woods around it. Something wrong, almost. I have quite a unique name, and most people just call me Ada, as it's easier to pronounce and remember. The only person who ever called me Adelaida is my grandma and teachers, the ones who don't like me. At the cottage, it was me, my sister Hannah, and my 3 friends, Kate, Loria, and Mylene. We were all down at the cottage for my 16th birthday, which was the weekend before with my parents. We were going to be there for a week. For context, I'll tell you a bit about the layout of the cottage. The front door had a path leading from it into the forest surrounding it. As you walked in, there was a big foyer with those weird L-shaped stairs in the corner of the room that led upstairs to all the bedrooms. It had 2 doors on either side of the room, one that led to the kitchen and the other that led to the living room. The kitchen had the door to the deck and the backyard that was basically just a patch of grass with a pool and surrounded by forest. There was no separation from the garden to the forest around it. The living room had a huge window at the side of the room that was adjacent to the couch and TV, so you couldn't see it unless you were standing facing towards the front of the house. There was also a door right next to the couch that led to the downstairs bathroom. The upstairs had a big landing that had a small snug area with a couch and a TV with video games. Once you get to the snug room, there are 2 hallways, one that leads to my parents' master bedroom and my little sister's room. Then the other hallway led to the 2 rooms my friends and I were staying over in. Me and Loria were in the bigger room, Jess and Mylene in the other. Now, this description may seem a little long and pointless, but trust me, it's important to the story. On the first night we were there was nothing wrong. In fact, everyone seemed to be having a great time. We played in the pool and drove 3 hours to the beach that wasn't far from the cottage. We went fishing, played in the sea. When we got back, my stepdad put on the fireplace in the back garden. We all sat around the fire pit, talking as it was midsummer, and it wasn't too dark out by then. After that, we all went to bed. Nothing out of the ordinary so far. This feeling of normalcy stayed present throughout the second day. My friends and I chilled by the pool while my stepdad and mom went to the city about 2 hours away to get food to last us the rest of the week. It was about 8 p.m. on the second night. My parents and sister still weren't back yet, which wasn't weird as it was a pretty busy city and the traffic was bad at the time. The sun had already begun to set below the tree line, and the sky was this blue-orange color. The sun was low enough to make the trees' shadows stretch like long fingers over the forest. The cottage was built south-facing, so there wasn't really a time of day when the pool and backyard didn't get any sunlight. I was just lounging on one of those pool donuts along with Loria and Jess, while Mylene sat on a sun lounger lining the pool. Those of us in the pool were just chilling and having a conversation, while Mylene was reading something, which was her choice. We did ask if she wanted to come in the pool, but she said no. She cued in once in a while to voice her opinion on the topic, but she wasn't very active in the conversation, which made it easy to get lost in the conversation and forget if she was listening. We were probably talking about something stupid, like the boys in our year, or girls we didn't like, and I turned to the sun lounger that Mylene was sat on 10 minutes ago, but she wasn't there. I began to look around to see if she was anywhere else in the background, but she wasn't. I asked the other girls if they had seen where she went, but they hadn't. I searched the whole cottage and our rooms to see if she was okay, but she was nowhere to be found at all. I went back to the garden to start shouting for her, because I'd begun to worry, as did the other girls. The sky was growing darker now, but the forest was almost pitch black, with only the pool light acting as a torch. I caught a glimpse of the bright pink bathing suit Mylene was wearing about 6 feet into the tree line. I told Loria to grab a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and she did, coming back in about 30 seconds. I shone the flashlight towards where I thought Mylene was standing, and I called her name. She didn't answer. I shouted again, and still no answer. Jess had begun to edge closer to the tree line, as we all grew more concerned for Mylene. Now, what we did next was such a dumb girl horror movie action, but we didn't know what would happen after. We all unanimously agreed to go into the trees to get her, so we began to march our way over to her, slightly annoyed because it felt as though she was purposefully ignoring us. I got within arm's reach of her and noticed she was looking up, but it didn't cross my mind to look up and see what she was looking at. As I made my way around her to see her front, my stomach dropped. When I saw her face, I nearly started to cry. I shouted for Jess and Loria to come look at this, and they both had almost the exact same reaction as me. She was still, arms by her side, looking up into the sky, but her eyes looked white, almost as if her eyes had rolled all the way to the back of her head. There was this weird saliva foam coming from the sides of her mouth, but no noise at all. Like, at all. I grabbed her face to try and see what was wrong with her, trying to make her look at me. I began crying, thinking she was having a seizure or a heart attack, and I started shouting for Jess and Loria to help me. But no one moved around me. I looked away from Mylene's face to the other girls, and I've never felt fear this much in my life. Jess was staring up at the same thing Mylene was, with her hand over her mouth and sobbing quietly, and Loria was nowhere that I could see. I then felt this overwhelming urge to tilt my head up and look at the sky. So I did, and when I did, my blood ran freezing cold. There was something unnameable up in the trees above us, an almost humanoid figure with gray-brown fur that covered its whole body, besides some patches where the almost black dry skin could be seen. Its face was a mix of a deer and a skeleton, almost as if someone had taken a deer skull and tried to paint it to look alive. The eyes were what terrified me the most. They were human eyes. It almost looked like a human wearing a suit of whatever that creature was supposed to be. It had wolf paws for feet, and the legs were like dogs' legs as well, with that weird backwards elbow that dogs have. But I could tell that if it stood upright, this thing would be over 6 feet. What looked like hands gripped 2 thick tree branches, with its long claws winding around the branches. I stared helplessly at it as tears quietly, literally streamed down my face. Then its face contorted into something that looked almost like a smile. Its mouth made the shape of a smile, but its eyes did not change, still holding that strange dead human eye look that made me want to vomit. I was stood staring for what felt like hours, surprised it hadn't jumped down and killed me. That's when its mouth began to move. No sound came out, besides a weird, straining sound. The sound you make after you try to breathe without anything to breathe from. Run, is what I picked up from the thing. So I grabbed Mylene and Jess by the wrists and began to sprint towards the cottage, which wasn't too far away from where we were standing, close enough to be able to see it. I heard rustling and panting coming from behind us, and we broke through the tree line into the garden, but I refused to stop until we were inside the kitchen with the back door locked. We made it back all in one piece, where we found Loria, who was standing at the door now with a bread knife in hand. But again, Mylene was not stood next to me. I heard a toilet flush upstairs, and Mylene made her way downstairs looking completely fine. "Oh, are we done outside? Sorry, I had a quick shower while you guys were in the pool." "What? So you weren't just outside in the woods?" I asked her with the utmost confusion. "Those creepy as heck woods? Nah, you couldn't pay me to go in there." She said it so calmly and jokingly. I looked over at Jess, who was there with me the entire time, and she just let out a groan, sinking down the wall to sit on the floor. There was nothing in the garden directly, but I could see just enough to know it was out there, standing in the tree line around maybe 6'9", staring directly at us with those beady little eyes. Then I could just make out that disgusting, awkward smile as it retreated back into the forest, right as I heard my mom and stepdad pulling up in the driveway. We told her what had happened, expecting her not to believe us, but when I described what it was that we saw, her face went pale. "Whatever you do, do not go back into the woods after dark. I don't care what you see or who you think you see. It lies." I was surprised the girls wanted to stay the rest of the week after what had just happened. I expected them to make up some excuse and get their parents to pick me up, but they didn't. Nothing else happened for the next 2 days, probably because we stayed inside when it got dark, and when we were awake we kept all the lights on in the house. I'd begun to think that that may have been the only thing that would happen, until the second to last day. We were all sat in the fire pit in the back garden just before the sun went down. My stepdad put the fire out before the sun dipped below the earth, and we all piled inside in the sitting room to watch TV. I went to go on my phone, but it wasn't anywhere at all. I couldn't find it. That's when I looked to the back garden from the big window of the living room, and there it was, on the seat in the fire pit. It had been a couple of days since what happened had happened, so I didn't feel that scared going out into the garden to grab my phone real quick. That's all I intended to do. I noticed that when I left the living room, Loria wasn't there. Normally, I would go look around the house for her, but this time I could remember so clearly that she had gone to her room to get changed out of her clothes, because she had asked if she could borrow some of my PJs. It was so clear in my mind that I knew where everyone was, which gave me such an uneasy feeling, almost like my mind knew something I didn't, always taking mental notes of everything. I made it outside to the fire pit by the pool. The only thing audible was the soft sound of the water in the lightly lit pool. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I grabbed my phone and went to head towards the door to the kitchen, when I heard a faint voice calling my name. "Adelaide." It was quiet enough to be a whisper, but loud enough for me to not be imagining it. I ignored it, knowing what was out there, and I started towards the door. "Adelaide." I froze in place. It was Loria's voice calling me from the tree line. She sounded stressed, maybe even pained, but still she had an almost joking or playful tone too, exactly like her. "Please help. I'm hurt. I fell over in the woods." I laughed to myself as muscle memory took over, and I began to walk towards the trees. "I'm coming, don't worry, you idiot." But then I froze in place as fear grew in my chest. I felt almost sick. The only people who ever call me Adelaida are my dad and my grandmother. Everyone else that I know calls me Ada. I don't even think my friends know that my full name is Adelaida. My eyes darted to the tree line, where the calling was coming from, and I saw it. That god-awful smile just behind the tree line. A tear rolled down my face. The urge to walk forward became overwhelmingly strong. I began to stalk towards that smile against my will, or so it felt, when I felt an arm grab my wrist. It was Loria. "Ada, what the heck are you doing?" she said, as she looked over my shoulder to where I was walking towards. "I don't know. I thought I heard you calling me from the woods. You said you'd fallen over." "No, I'm right here. Let's go inside. The woods give me the creeps at night." We went into the kitchen, and I looked back to the trees one last time. There it was, standing closer towards the garden. It was shaking its head, no. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. Thoughts raced through my mind. What would have happened if I went into the trees to that thing? If Loria hadn't come out to get me? Honestly, I didn't want to find out. We went home a day early, due to the weather, as it started thundering the last day. As we made our way out of the woods, a tree caught my eye. It was the tree that me and my grandma carved our names into. But she hadn't carved Ada into the tree. She had carved my whole name. The tree said, Adelaida and Grandma, with a huge 5-finger claw mark right below it. I never went back to the cottage after that time. Gladly so. Me, Loria, Jess, and Mylene stayed friends throughout the rest of school, and we frequently talked about what happened until the topic died down and became a distant, horrifying memory. I still meet up with them often, and the week gets brought up sometimes, but now we laugh and look back on it. Deep down, though, I know that whatever was in that forest was pure evil, and I often wonder what would have happened if I went into the woods. Would I still be here today? I'm 21 now. This happened years ago. I still have nightmares about that week, and sometimes when I'm alone and it's just quiet enough, I hear that voice, Loria's, softly shouting my full name, and it gives me chills every time. They are always listening. From My Life in Thriller Mode. This series of unfortunate events takes place in Latin America. Before I begin telling my story, it's important to understand my family's history. Chinese blood runs through my veins, and it is said that our ancestors practiced dark magic. It has always been kind of a taboo topic for us, the unspoken subject during family gatherings and dinner. With this in mind, it was not strange for me to be drawn to the unknown. I've always been a fan of horror movies, the paranormal, and the gorier it gets, the better it is for me. Around 15 years ago, as children, we had access to unlimited content, which was not always appropriate. We could watch someone being shot in the face on YouTube, someone falling off a cliff, half of their head gone. It was crazy, and my life back then was a search for the dark side. Not like I would practice witchcraft or anything, but I was definitely learning more about types of ghosts, creepypasta, and violence, while also making cookies in my free time. The reason I am telling you this is because it's important to the main story. I've always worked a corporate job, which I kind of liked, which also explains why I feel dead inside. It was a well-paying job from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. I lived alone with my puppy and had a very simple life. We used to live in the same house, but I rented the apartment to my grandfather back then to feel independent, I guess. The house was pretty big, and all I know is that a police officer used to live there. That was the story, nothing more than that. I'd also broken up with my boyfriend at the time, so you can imagine I was a mess. Those moments are very appealing to uninvited guests. A few parts of the encounters are blurry in my mind. Not sure if that is a good or bad thing, but as of right now, I feel it's a blessing. So it all started with bruises on my hands and arms while I was sleeping. I kept telling myself that I probably hit something during the night or earlier in the day and didn't remember. It had been a while since I'd seen my mother, and work was overwhelming. I was feeling tired all the time, and my dinners were mostly chicken noodle soup. I was getting ready for bed when I heard a voice whisper my name, Stephanie. A cold sensation ran through my body, and I couldn't move. Was what I just heard real? My puppy was right next to me, and he didn't want to leave my side. He was in a guard position. I decided it was probably the long workdays getting into my already weak mind. But then, the dreams started. I was alone in a supermarket. The shelves were full, and I couldn't see the end of them. I just kept walking endlessly through the giant aisles. I felt uncomfortable, like someone was watching me, getting closer, even though I couldn't hear footsteps. The lights began to flicker, and then I saw her, a tall woman with a thin figure. She had long gray hair and was wearing a white dress. Now that I think about it, it seemed more like a hospital gown. Her smile, I'll never forget that smile. It was twisted, stretching from one side to the other, like it would hurt to hold it that way. I couldn't move. I remember her running toward me, incredibly fast, holding a vessel, a blue vessel with strange symbols. To this day, I don't know what they meant, but I felt like she wanted me inside it. Suddenly, thank God, my legs responded, and I ran. I ran like my life depended on it, because it felt like it did. She was getting closer. I dropped to my knees and began to pray then. Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this day be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide. I repeated the prayer over and over again. I could see myself almost yelling at the thing to go away, and I felt protected by a warm force. I was so scared that I didn't even notice I was crying. And in the blink of an eye, I woke up. I was drenched in sweat. It took me a few minutes to catch my breath and to process what happened. I walked into the living room. At the time, I had fuchsia furniture. When I was about to sit down, I noticed something. Worms. Not just one, there were several. Small worms still alive. Those worms, the kind that appear when something is rotten. I even had one fall from my hair while I was at work, and to this day I still don't know how they got there. It took me the rest of the night to clean everything, and I could not go back to sleep after that. I was miserable at work. I wasn't myself. I used to be the top performer, the one everyone would hate, but at that point, I didn't even care anymore. The weekend arrived, and I asked my friends to come over to cheer me up. We made sushi and started watching scary movies, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like my life was getting back to normal. I laughed, and just as they were about to leave, the patio door opened by itself. And I'm talking about a heavy metal door, opening all on its own. Then the TV turned off and on a couple of times. Everything happened so fast that even my friends didn't know what to do. They're into crystals and energy, so we decided to ignore it, to pretend nothing had happened. But the real turning point was yet to come. I decided to stay a few days with my mom. Maybe a change of environment was all I needed. During those 4 weeks, I lost around 20 pounds, and while some people might say I looked great, I did not feel great. One night we had a girls' night, ate pizza, and I had 2 days of such deep sleep that I felt like I would never wake up. I was starting to feel better. But on the drive back home, she said something that made my heart stop. She asked me if I was okay. That might sound normal to you, but I've always been good at hiding my feelings. So I asked, almost defensively, "Why do you ask?" She hesitated. "Last week before you arrived, I had a strange dream." "What was it about?" I asked. "I was in a white space. There was nobody there except the devil." I felt my chest tighten. "I was on my knees and he told me, 'I will take one of your sons with me.'" Now, my mom has always been very religious, so she said she started to pray. "He said again, 'I will take one of your sons with me.'" And so she prayed harder. "He just kept saying it, 'I will take one of your sons with me.'" She said the voice became angrier, frustrated by her prayers. "And I said to him, 'I will not give you any of my sons.'" She said the dream went on for what felt like hours. She woke up, at last, crying. When she finished telling me, there was a long silence. I was having this internal battle, deciding whether to tell her everything that had been happening to me. But I knew I needed help, so I told her everything. About the worms and bruises and the lights, everything. Her expression changed. Not angry, just sad. like she was hurt that I would keep all of this from her. She stayed with me for a few days. I began praying more often, every night before going to bed. I'm not telling you to do the same as I did in a situation like this, but for me, I felt relief. I started to take better care of myself. I began going outside again, something I had completely stopped doing for a while. Feeling the sunlight on my face, little by little, the events began to fade. I even kept a Bible by my side. Again, I'm not telling you you have to do that. I'm just saying it worked for me. When I look back on this, I realize I used to be someone who loved taking risks. Someone who would search anything, watch anything, without limits, dedicating so much time to the horrors of the world. And while that part of me still exists somewhere, I'm not the same person anymore. The days of searching for monsters are over for me. Because I learned something. Sometimes those monsters find you first. I never truly understood what triggered everything that happened during that time in my life, but I'll tell you this. The entities beyond our world are always listening. They wait. They wait for you to be weak, tired, broken, and that is when they act. I had a rough year, and it did not go unnoticed. You are not asking for my advice, but I'll give it anyway. Take care of yourself, keep your mind busy, and remember, they are always listening. My Dogman/Wolfman encounter. From Jason from Texas. Me, my wife, and my son were on our way back home from seeing a movie. So, needless to say, we were in a good mood. We were laughing and joking around about the movie we just saw. It was a Marvel movie, if I remember right, but I can't be sure which one. Anyway, we live in a small farming town in Texas, so that in itself should tell you what it kind of looks like here. As we were slowing down a bit, coming around a curve into the outside of town, right before the turnoff to get onto the street we live on, there was what I thought was a darn big wild hog in the middle of the road, eating something. Now, if you live out in the country, you know you don't want to hit or get hit by a wild hog, and it doesn't matter what kind of vehicle you're in. So I slowed down, way down. I sat there for about a minute, and the thing didn't move. So I decided to flash my lights to maybe spook him, so it would run off. But when I did that, something didn't look right. So I flipped on my brights and regretted it almost immediately. For reference here, I'm in a 4x4 Chevy Avalanche with a grill guard, so I sit up off the ground a little ways. When this thing stood up, it was head and shoulders above my cab. As he stood up, and yes, it was a he, because it was very plain to see, I heard my son say, "Dad, what the heck is that?" And my wife was crying, saying, "Oh my God," as the thing turned around to glare at me. What we could clearly see now was a dog-man or wolf-man. He glared right at me with these glowing yellow-red eyes. Then he growled this deep, vibrating, frightening growl that you can hear even with all the windows up. Feel it deep inside your chest, too. My wife, crying, crawled into the floorboard, and my son was panicking in the back seat. But me, I was frozen. Not necessarily out of fear or panic, but that dang growl of his. That somehow locked me into place, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move. My hands were white-knuckling the steering wheel, and I was just stuck there making eye contact with this thing. All of a sudden, this image ran through my mind in a second. A vision of this thing running and jumping through my windshield, ripping out my son's throat, tearing my wife apart, not being able to do anything to stop it, to help my family. As that went through my head, I swear that thing smiled at me. And right then, he snapped his head to the side like someone slapped him and dropped to all fours. He ran off so fast you could barely see him. As soon as I could move again, I slammed my foot down on the gas, and we got out of there. These days, we don't talk about it. My wife just refuses, and my son will say, "Yeah, I remember that day." then quickly changes the subject. But me, I can remember everything. Those eyes, the hatred and anger in his thoughts towards me. The thoughts I saw of what it wanted to do. To this day, it frightens me, and I hope and pray I never see it again. Something terrific for you guys to hear about. From Snowpup1. I have a horror story that happened to me in 11th grade, and it was horrific. So here I go. I hope afterward you'll be able to sleep well tonight, by the way. So at my school, I was at basketball practice, and I went to use the school shower to clean myself. But I'd slipped and woke up a few hours later in the darkness. When I got up, I heard heavy breathing, and I went to find out what the noise was. I stood there, paralyzed, the cold tile stinging my bare feet. The heavy breathing wasn't coming from the stalls. It was coming from the shadows near the back equipment cage. It was ragged, wet, like someone struggling to catch their breath after a long run. As my eyes adjusted to the pitch black, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The heavy metal door to the hallway wasn't just closed, it had been propped shut from the outside with a heavy equipment bench. I was effectively locked in. "Is someone there?" The breathing stopped instantly. For a minute, the silence was so heavy, I could hear the blood thumping in my ears. Then a soft metallic tink-tink-tink sound started. It was the sound of something hard, like a ring or a tool, tapping slowly against the metal lockers. Step, tap, step, tap. Someone was walking toward me, trailing their hand along the lockers in the dark. "Coach? Mike? This isn't funny." No one answered. Instead, a locker door about 10 feet away creaked open slowly. The hinges screamed in the silence, then another one, and another. Someone was opening them, one by one, moving closer to my stall. I didn't wait to see who it was. I grabbed my bag, shoved my shoulder against that propped door with every bit of adrenaline I had, and I felt the bench scrape across the floor as the door gave way. I did not stop running until I hit the streetlights in the parking lot. The worst part? When I got home and emptied my bag, I found a small rusted locker key tucked inside my shoe. I don't own a locker key, and when I checked the school records the next day, a janitor from back in the day passed away in that locker room 3 years ago to that day. The Man at My Window. From Zane. I'm 33 years old. I currently live with my wife and 2 kids, but what I'm recounting here dates back to when I lived alone at 23 years old, a whole decade ago. The story starts with me driving home after a birthday party for my niece at the time. She had just turned 9, but when I got home I found the front door unlocked. Rather than thinking the worst of it, I simply thought, dang it, I forgot to lock the door. How careless of me. Probably my fault for being in a rush to get to the birthday party. When I walked in, that idea was further solidified, because nothing had been ransacked or stolen from my apartment. That was until I found black handprints, the size of an adult's, lining my bedroom doorframe and the foot of my bed. As I said before, I lived alone at the time, so the thought of a homeless man or some stranger under my bed creeped me out. But when I looked under the bed, I found nothing, not a single trace of another soul. The night after that, I was on a call with my mom to just talk and chat. When I brought up the black handprints from the night before, she froze up, saying that a single man who lived in the apartment some while ago had died there because of a fire. She said the handprints could be from the dead, his spirit haunting me. She laughed it off, though, and so did I, and I thought it was just a joke. But for the following week, I found more and more handprints appearing, spots where I would have just cleaned, too, not even 10 minutes ago. I had just ended a phone call with my dad when I heard a distinct tapping on glass. Mind you, I lived on the second floor of the apartment complex, so I freaked out and froze up. hiding under my bed without making too much noise. I remembered the window next to it was open, just a little bit, and that little bit was all that dark figure needed to enter my home. And enter it did. Something came inside, something with burnt, crispy skin that smelled somehow of bleach and burned skin at the same time. Something akin to roadkill forgotten in a Texas heatwave for a week and left to burn there on the road. As the figure moved throughout the apartment, I heard it searching the closet just 3 feet away from where I lay hidden, searching for me. It was about to find me when I heard a ring. I'd left my phone downstairs, and it was now ringing. I knew this was my chance. While it was distracted, I bolted out of my hiding spot and landed in the bushes outside my window about 15 feet down. By some miracle, I landed softly. Even so, I heard it coming for me. I always kept my keys clipped to my side. If I hadn't, I'm not sure I would be here right now. But I got to my car and I started it. I reversed, skidding and speeding away. I didn't stop driving until I made it to where my parents lived. Even to this day, I have nightmares about what I saw and what happened. Was that a real person, or a demon, or a very angry spirit? May God have mercy on us all. I won't dare go back there. From Ace of Spades 666. This happened a few weeks ago. Me and my siblings were out of school for Easter break. Part of our tradition for being out of school for Easter was to go up to my grandparents' house. They live in Maryland, in the Appalachian Mountain region, and behind their house there's this hilly area with lots of grass and rocks. But behind that there's an area with lots of trees, and part of that area is a small, almost completely hidden trail. You can go back there for a few miles, I'm sure. Part of my fun there was going back there alone. What a stupid idea that was. We live in a really flat area by the ocean, and the mountains are magical. Being out there alone feels like a gift, and in fact it is, when you're not being stalked by some horrifying thing. This is where the story starts. I was regularly out there alone. I would walk until I got to a large fallen tree. The reason I did not want to go past it was because I couldn't see the house anymore at that point, and I did not want to get lost out in the woods. So on the day that I'm going to tell you about, I was walking back there, and I finally reached the fallen tree. So I decided to turn around and keep walking. But a few seconds after I turned around, I got that feeling. You know, that feeling you get when something is about to extend its hand to touch you. That was the feeling, and it gave me chills. I decided to run as fast as I could, and to get back to the exit of the trail, and luckily I made it. Once I left, I just stayed inside for the rest of the day. The next day I made the dumb decision to go back in, because I'm an idiot. I honestly don't know what I was thinking. It's probably because I felt brave. I'd possibly discovered something, and I had a big pocket knife. I would probably be fine, right? So when I went back, everything seemed normal for the first few minutes. But then the music I was listening to changed to this extremely quiet song. The kind that's so quiet, you can hear everything around you while listening to it. And as a follower of the paranormal and someone who knows a lot about the Appalachian Mountains, I know that when the forest goes quiet around you, nothing good is about to happen. And in fact, in that moment, the forest went quiet around me. Once again, I decided to turn around and not look back. But as I was walking, I swear I saw something in my peripheral vision, keeping pace with me behind some trees. Its skinny, pale form seemed almost human, but too tall and wrong. I wanted to run like I did before, to get the heck out of that area, but I was scared to run this time. I was worried if I did, it would trigger the thing to pursue me, and I didn't know if I could outrun it. So I just walked as calmly as I could, and eventually I got back to the exit of the small trail. And once I did, I ran as fast as I could, but decided to still stay outside. Again, because I'm an idiot. I stayed outside until it got darker, and I couldn't really see a few feet in front of me anymore. That's when I heard footsteps, and you may be saying, oh, it's probably just a fox or a deer. But these were heavy footsteps, and it sounded like it was on 2 feet. I hoped it was just my dad, but when I called out to him, there was no answer. Something was wrong. I speed-walked back into the house and found everybody sitting in the living room. No one had left. None of them could have been the sound I heard outside. I decided not to go back to that trail at all for the rest of the trip. That's all, unfortunately for you, but luckily for me. Honestly, I think it was something that a lot of the listeners of this show might be familiar with. And I don't want to say its name here, because listening to this podcast has taught me that talking about this specific thing might draw it back to you. In fact, the reason I think it was stalking me at all was likely that I'd been talking about it quite a lot during that trip, and I think it noticed. My House is Haunted. From Gremlin Studios 78. I live in a modest home in Rexburg, Idaho, with my 2 younger brothers, my parents, and my 10-year-old Chihuahua Luna. My grandparents live in the house across the street from where I live. We lived in their basement until 2021. Then we bought the house across the street and moved in. My house has 2 upper levels for the bedrooms. The main floor has the kitchen, and the basement has the living room, workout room, and crawl space. No one goes in the crawl space because it's filled with bugs and mice, and it just gives me the chills. My family was the 3rd family to live in that house. The 2nd family moved to Alaska after the COVID pandemic, and the 1st family built the house, but the husband became paralyzed in a horse riding accident, so the house has some holes and weird doors everywhere from his wheelchair ramps and other things. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but I never thought I'd live in a house that was definitely haunted. Although it's only my dad and I who have had these encounters with a supposed entity here, and we are the only ones that believe there is something here. I've had a few encounters with the ghost in my house which have all been interesting. My first few encounters with the ghost were small things, like moving packages that were stacked on the entryway, or hearing slight knocks on our windows and walls during the night. The noises and things started to get weirder the longer we lived in the house. Lights flickered, the ceiling fan would spin like someone tapped it, but one of the weirdest things I've seen was in our laundry room. The lights start flickering in there often, and the toilet in the kitchen bathroom will flush on its own sometimes. Then the washer started to turn on by itself. My dad is a handyman. He has built and wired several houses, so he checked the fuses on everything, and it all looked perfectly fine to him. After the washer incident, the odd things stopped, and I didn't see much else for a while. But then, a few weeks ago, I was up late on my phone scrolling YouTube Shorts, and I suddenly had a feeling that someone was watching me. So I quickly turned off my phone and hid it under my pillow, and I glanced up. What I saw there I will never forget. My room was completely dark, which was normal, but I looked around the room and saw a silver-blue orb that was floating over my body. It moved close to my ceiling and then vanished. My heart was pounding as I sat up, and I tried to understand what I had just seen. Then I looked toward my closet, and I saw the bag that was filled with pins I'd made hanging on my door start to sway, like something touched it. I told my dad about the experience, but not about me being on my phone, because I wasn't supposed to be on it at the time. Then he told me that sometimes when he would walk into the kitchen from the garage or laundry room, he would see a figure standing in the corner by my desk, and when he would turn towards it, it would be gone. This would happen sometimes, so it couldn't just be weird lighting or bad eyesight. Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched, which I've gotten used to, considering most of the time the feeling is more of a watching over me feeling. Rarely is it ever hostile, though it has been on some occasions. I don't know the whole lore to the house just yet, and I've not caught anything on camera yet, but I truly believe that I have some sort of attachment, considering most of the encounters had something to do with me. I've become used to these things, but I felt like I needed to share this with someone else, so now it no longer has to be just me and my dad knowing about it. It got inside my house. From Ginger Kid. These incidents have been happening for around 12 years now, but last night, it was brave enough to make a move. For full context, we'll go back to the summer of 2013. I was 6 years old when I went to summer camp for the first time with Cub Scouts. It was late at night, and I woke up to use the bathroom. I also completely ignored the buddy system. As we were out in the woods, the bathroom was just a latrine, about 200 feet away from the site my pack was set up at. I unzipped the door of the two-person tent that I had to myself, and I stepped outside. It was dark, pitch dark, save for the sparse moonlight that reached the ground through the tree canopy. As I made my way, I could have sworn I'd heard something behind me, but I didn't see anything. I thought it was a deer, some other animal Appalachia is known for. And then I saw it. Off about 30 feet to my left was a pale, tall thing with no facial features I could make out, given the dim light, except its eyes. And they were so wrong. They were too far apart and too small, with no sclera, just black voids that seemed to pierce my soul. It ran away, and I didn't see it again. Well, back in May of last year, I awoke to the sound of tapping on my window, and when I looked outside, I saw nothing, and I was sure of that because the street I live on is very well lit. I got back in bed, and a few minutes after that, I heard my mom calling out, not targeted towards me, but just calling out. The thing was, at the time, she was at work, 20 minutes away from my house. This was the first time I ever felt true fear, because I'd recently learned about skinwalkers. I panicked, running to my parents' room, and I fell asleep in there. That was the last of it, or at least that's what I thought to myself to help me stay calm. Because then there was last night. I was home alone because my parents had to go to an event for work. I was lying in bed, just reading a comic book, when I heard something moving outside my window. I looked outside, which was the first of my mistakes. It moved around to the back of my house, and I followed. I don't know why. I guess I was just curious, not really having much else to do. It stopped about 20 feet from the kitchen window. I parted a small gap in the blind and saw it. This weird dog thing. It had the same void eyes. I gasped, and it hurt me. It looked at me. I should have reacted faster, because when I finally went to run, it had already scrambled onto my porch. I heard it, trying to open the back door, fiddling around with the doorknob. I ran upstairs to my parents' room, grabbing the Remington SP-10 that my dad got for if someone ever broke in. I grabbed 18 shells, excluding the 3 already loaded into it, and I ran up into the attic. Then I heard glass. The thing had broken down the door. I was terrified. I really thought I was about to die. I heard it moving around on all fours. First, it was in the living room. I assume when it didn't find what it was looking for, it moved up to the second floor. Then the attic door suddenly broke. No lead up, no warning. It moved slowly, terrifyingly slow, like it knew I was there and that I was scared. It felt like it was toying with me. Every 15, maybe 20 seconds, a step. I heard it inch a bit further. 5 minutes passed, and I'd fully lost track of how far it had gotten inside. I was just too blinded by fear. I then saw its head, its neck, arms, torso. It was facing me, standing up on its back legs. Its arms were longer than its legs, and it was so horribly thin, like it hadn't had food in weeks. It just stood there, eyeing me down like a predator to prey. Prey that was too scared to move. But somewhere inside, I found courage. I aimed, and I fired. I shot at it 3 times. It staggered back a bit, and I reloaded the gun as fast as I possibly could. Another 3 shots hit it center mass. I kept going, until I had no more ammunition. It was dead, I thought. After that many slugs, I'm not sure any of them even missed. I sat there crying to myself. I didn't know what to do. I ran down to the 2nd floor. All the doors were open, everything, cabinets, dressers, beds thrown around. It had been looking for me. I called my parents, then the police. But by the time anyone showed up and went to investigate what I told them about in the attic, they didn't find a body. My parents were extremely concerned and confused. We packed up suitcases and started driving. And for now, we've been staying at a hotel in South Carolina. And I have no idea how long we're gonna be here. While I do miss my home, I'm scared of ever seeing that thing again, whatever it was. What is it with people killing or nearly killing the bad guy and just walking away? If the monster that had been hunting me down all summer appeared in my room and I shot it 20 times, I wouldn't just walk away and go call mommy and daddy. I'd be finding a gallon of gasoline and some matches. It's gonna be a really warm night. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. I'll be honest with you. This show, me, my family, and this network, EerieCast as a whole, we're in a bit of a tight situation because YouTube is demonetizing all the creators it possibly can, apparently. And it seems like the only way we can be safe is if we can get as many listeners as possible to go to Eerie.fm and sign up for an account. Listen to our shows there, and especially consider signing up to be a member for $8 a month. Not only will you be supporting us and keeping us afloat, but you'll be unlocking a bunch of cool bonuses. Bonus episodes, exclusive audiobooks and ebooks. Never listen to an ad again on any of our shows. 20% off anything in our merch store, and more. If that's something you can do, thank you so very much for keeping EerieCast going. Till next time, everyone, be safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. This episode is brought to you by Eerie.fm, the best way to listen to this show and all of my narrations. For $8 a month, you can become a premium member and listen to hours of exclusive narrations from me that you can't find anywhere else. Narrations like Dogwood, a horror novel audiobook with over 6 hours of terrifying Georgia wilderness and Southern Gothic noir. Just go to EERIE.fm to listen now. That's Eerie.fm, the home of horror audio. The Skinwalker returns in today's extremely unsettling story, sent in by someone named Gabario Cart, a story titled, "The Government is Covering Up Skinwalkers." In this story, a man who is a contracted hunter on BLM land stumbles upon a disturbing encounter that leaves him changed forever. But he's not the only one who knows the truth. Don't be the one who cries, Skinwalker. I never thought I'd be a whistleblower, especially reaching out to a podcast of all places to blow that whistle, so to speak. And yet, here I am. I appreciate you taking the time to review this. I've got no idea if this will reach any ears. I've used a pen name for this story to remain anonymous, and none of the real names will match up. Most folks don't actually believe in skinwalkers. That's just a kid's bedtime story or a viral topic on the internet that has no basis in the real world. Those people are lucky, because they can sleep pretty well at night. There's also a good chunk of folks who refuse to speak of it, because they know how very real it is. And while I understand that sentiment, would you not feel duty-bound to report a serial killer in the woods? A kidnapper in our parks? Especially if you witnessed it firsthand. I don't want to come off sounding crazy, but I pretty much have no other choice. What I'm about to tell you is the craziest and most mind-altering experience, or rather series of events, of my life. A person has likely never gone from ghosts and monsters are fake Hollywood drivel to, oh yeah, them suckers are real, faster than this guy. So, I've got a dream job. especially for the dudes out there. I hunt for a living, and I don't mean living off of elk bone stew in some 200 square foot cabin in the middle of nowhere. I'm no hermit. I'm actually contracted by the government, specifically the BLM, which stands for Bureau of Land Management. They pay me to basically live in the woods for weeks at a time, sometimes even months, hunting or trapping whichever animal population they find problematic. They've got dozens of bunkhouses and field stations in the land I operated in, some basically just little trailers on cinder blocks. But when you're being paid to sleep there and do your favorite thing in the world, there's not really much room to complain. This was back in the 90s. I dropped out of college my first year. I'd been going for a degree in childhood education. Funny, huh? And I moved back in with my mom looking for work. I looked for the basic starter stuff at first, like dishwashing for local restaurants or maybe trying not to die of heat stroke at a metal factory. From a high school friend, I learned something interesting. We often talk about things at night, and the conversation moved on to which job would you take even if it paid basically nothing. And I had replied that I wished I could live in the woods and hunt for a living. Then he told me that is actually a thing. The government actually hires folks to cull animal populations on BLM land. But getting a contract like that is extremely difficult. My mind was made up right there, though, because up to that point I had no idea I could even do that. I thought forest work started and ended at the guy in funny pants and wide-brimmed hat nagging Yogi Bear about harassing campers. So I started to look into it. This was back when AOL still ruled the world and finding niche government job postings meant wading through dead links and PDFs that crashed Internet Explorer. I printed out everything I could find about wildlife management positions, and I read through them at the kitchen table, while my mom watched Wheel of Fortune in the living room. Most of the listings were full-time biologist jobs that needed a master's degree, which obviously wasn't going to happen for me. Buried under all that, there was a category for short-term wildlife services contractors. Those requirements were way more achievable. You needed a hunter education certificate, which I already had from when I was 12. They wanted a clean background check. They also wanted proof of marksmanship that they verified at a regional office, plus a sit-down with 2 field supervisors, who basically wanted to make sure you're just not a lunatic. It took me almost 8 months to actually land my first contract. I drove down to the Salt Lake City regional office in my mom's '88 Buick that overheated if you idled for too long. The 2 supervisors asked me a bunch of questions about field experience and ethics. They wanted to know what I'd do if I encountered a wounded animal that wasn't on my contract list. The more important part of the interview was just whether I came across as a reasonable and steady person. They don't want someone flaky or some adrenaline junkie alone with a rifle for 2 months at a stretch. 2 weeks later, I got a letter offering me a 30-day contract on the Wasatch Front to help control mule deer in an area where they were eating up private alfalfa fields adjacent to public land. The pay was not amazing, but it covered my expenses, and I would get to live in a little forest service cabin that was nicer than my bedroom at my mom's house. That contract went smooth as butter. I came in under quota, kept clean logs, and made friends with a local game warden who'd swing by every few days to check in. His name was Cal, and he ended up being the guy who recommended me for several of my contracts. After that, the work just kept coming. I did a feral hog cull down in San Juan County. Later, I helped run a coyote contract up near the Idaho border. By '94, I'd built up enough of a reputation. I was getting offered some of the longer assignments, the ones that scared off the newer guys, because they meant being out in the brush for 60 or 90 days at a time with minimal contact. And that's how I ended up taking more and more work in the Uintah Basin. The Uintah Basin sits in the northeastern corner of Utah. It's a huge stretch of high desert right along the south slope of the Uintah Mountains. The Ute Reservation takes up a massive portion of it. There's farming and ranching country out there, plus oil and gas operations that were just starting to ramp up back then when I was working there. Off the highway, it's mostly a whole lot of nothing. I liked it out there. The sky goes on forever, and the air smells like sage and wood smoke. You can drive for an hour on those access roads and pass maybe 3 other vehicles. For a guy who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his rifle and his coffee, it was paradise. The locals were polite, mostly, though some of them gave me the side-eye when they figured out I was a contracted culler. There's a particular kind of look you get from old ranchers who think the BLM is just one short step removed from communism. The way I'd usually get to know people in this line of work was through what we called crossover. The land out there is managed by a patchwork of agencies. BLM has the bulk of it. Forest Service handles the higher timber tracts. The state runs DWR with their own wardens, while the tribe manages reservation land separately with their own game wardens. Beyond all the agencies, you've also got oil surveyors and cattle leasers showing up on the same access roads. Everybody overlaps eventually. Whenever I rolled into a new area, the first thing I'd do was check in at the field station, meeting whoever was running the show. Then, over the next few weeks, I'd inevitably bump into that same handful of guys at the gas station outside Vernal, or out on the access roads themselves. We'd nod, eventually we'd talk, and after a contract or two, you'd consider some of them friends. The Forest Service guys especially were always happy to have somebody new to share a beer with after dark, since they were stuck in those bunkhouses for weeks at a time, the same as me. There were 3 guys specifically I got tight with during my Uintah Basin years. There was Wes, a Forest Service maintenance worker who'd been doing the job since the late 70s, and he was the one that told us the most stories around the fire pit. Ben was about my age and worked for the state DWR doing wildlife surveys. He played skeptic to anything Wes brought up, and he would do so loudly. Then there was an older fellow named Henry, who I think was actually retired from BLM, but kept getting pulled back in for consulting work because he knew the backcountry better than the maps did. Henry was the quiet one of the bunch. He'd listen and nod, and only occasionally drop something into the conversation, but it would usually make you put your beer down on the table real careful-like. Now, Wes was the one who said that word to me. We were sitting on the steps of a Forest Service cabin somewhere south of Roosevelt, drinking warm cans of Coors because the cooler had run out of ice 3 days earlier. The sun had just dropped behind the ridge, and the sky was a deep blue, which meant the stars would soon be out. I was about 3 weeks into a contract, feeling pretty good about everything. I made some offhand comment about how the silence out there could play tricks on a man, that I'd been hearing what sounded like a woman crying off in the trees the night before, but I had told myself it was a fox or maybe a mountain lion making its weird calls. Wes's face got real serious. Where exactly were you camped?" he asked. I told him. He made a face I didn't really understand at the time, then drank some of his beer and looked out at the trees. "You might want to camp somewhere else for the rest of this contract." "Why's that?" He drank even more of his beer before answering. "Some of the locals call that ridge a Skinwalker Ridge. They don't go up there at night. Even the hunters won't." I laughed, genuinely. I thought he was messing with the new guy, doing the whole rural ghost story bit to scare the city slicker. "Wes, I grew up hunting. Pretty sure I can tell the difference between a fox and some witch." He didn't laugh back, but of course he did take another bigger drink. "Suit yourself, but if you hear that crying again, don't go looking for it." The way he said that scrubbed the smile right off my face. He sat there with his eyes on the trees, not cracking a grin, and not taking back his quote-unquote joke. I changed the subject, and we ended up talking about fishing for an hour. Afterwards, I went to bed in that cabin with a weird feeling in my chest, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't double-check the door to make sure it was locked. The next morning, I told myself Wes had been pulling my leg, that he was just being colorful, but the doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, I began to pick up on little things. There was this waitress at a diner outside Vernal, who, when I mentioned I was working a contract up in a particular area, glanced at the window and changed my coffee order without comment. There was a guy at the hardware store in Duchesne who clocked the BLM patch on my hat. "You been seeing anything weird out there?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "Oh, you know what I mean." That's all I got. He rang me up without saying another word. The guys who ran the gas station near the Bottle Hollow turnoff would close a half hour earlier than the sign said and lock the door behind themselves so fast you'd think they were being chased. It was nothing concrete, nothing you could really point to in any one moment, but you start to notice when an entire region gets quiet at sundown. Ben, the DWR guy, never wanted to talk about any of it. He'd roll his eyes when Wes brought it up. He'd say it was a bunch of inbred nonsense from people who didn't have cable television, and he'd say it loud and clear every single time. I noticed, though, that Ben never volunteered to take the night surveys when those came up on the rotation. He'd swap with anyone, even pulling weekend shifts, just to keep his hours in the daylight. I even asked him about it. He just said he liked seeing what he was counting. But I don't think that was the whole story. Not after knowing what I know now. Henry was different. Henry didn't deny a thing. But he wouldn't just give up the information either. You had to ask him and be clear about it. Even then, he'd turn the question around on you and want to know why you were asking, what you'd seen, what you've heard, before he'd give you a straight answer. I always got the impression he was deciding whether you could handle his answer. It took me about 2 months of running into Henry at the field station coffee pot before he finally told me a story of his own. We were both stuck inside one afternoon, waiting out a thunderstorm that had blown in fast from the west. He was sitting at the little fold-out table cleaning a knife. I was reading a paperback novel I'd already read twice. After a stretch of nothing but rain on our roof, he spoke up. "You ever hear the story about that survey crew up on Diamond Mountain in '78? "Can't say that I have, Henry." "There were 4 of them. Forest Service contractors doing a timber assessment. 2 grad students working alongside 2 professional surveyors. They were running a logging road that doesn't even exist on any current map. Got rained out about 10 days into the assignment, and ended up bunking in a Forest Service cabin, older than any of them. 4 went in, only 3 came back. The 4th was a kid named Caleb, 22 years old, out of Logan. A decent surveyor who'd done 2 seasons already." I heard a scraping sound and looked over at Henry. He had stopped what he was doing to test the edge of his knife on his thumbnail. Kinda grossed me out. Always hated sounds like that. "Now, here's the part nobody at the agency wanted in the report. The other 3 didn't lose track of Caleb during the day. He didn't wander off into the woods, didn't fall down some ravine. They were sleeping in the cabin and they all heard him get up around 3 a.m. They heard the door open and shut, and they heard him walk off into the trees. They figured he was going to take a leak, so they went back to sleep. When they woke up at dawn, his bunk was empty. The rifle he'd brought was still leaning against the wall by the door, but his boots were gone." Gotta say, that's kinda creepy. Did they ever find him? Well, they found his boots." Another scrape, scrape, scrape. Yikes. "Set neatly side by side on a flat rock in the middle of a clearing, about a 1/4 mile up the ridge from the cabin. Looked like somebody had taken them off and placed them right there. The ground around that rock was soft from the rain, but somehow there were no footprints leading up to it or away from it. No sign of how Caleb or anyone else got there or away. The boots were just sitting there." So what did the official report say? "Well, it said Caleb probably got disoriented in the storm and walked off a ledge somewhere they couldn't access. Search and rescue ran the area for a week and didn't find nothing else. The family eventually got a death certificate, and the agency had to move on." He set that knife down on the table. The part that always bothered me is that those boots had laces on them. They were tied. Whoever set them on that rock had to have untied them, taken them off, then tied them back up before placing them down." I thought about that for a moment. The rain had let up and I could hear water dripping off the eaves of the cabin in a slow, tired rhythm. "Do you think it was a person?" I asked. "Maybe some psychopath out in the woods?" He raised an eyebrow and started to think. "You want the answer that's gonna let you sleep tonight?" he said. or the one I actually believe? Well, Henry never gave me the comfortable answer. Give me the one you actually believe, I said. He set the knife down again, and he looked at the table while he talked, not at me. Whatever set those boots on that rock wasn't a man, wasn't anything human at all, but it knew enough about us to tie the laces back up before it put them down. How's that worse than a person doing it? Because a person doing it is a person doing it. You can hunt a person down. A person leaves prints, gets tired, sleeps somewhere eventually. Whatever did this didn't leave prints in wet ground a child could have tracked through. It didn't have to tie those laces, but it did. Caleb's family was never gonna see those boots. Nobody but the agency was gonna see them. Whoever set them on that rock tied them back up because they wanted us to know they could. They? It. They. I don't have another word that fits. What do you mean by it, Henry? He smacked his lips a couple of times, then talked. You'll know when you see it. That's not a real answer. Sorry, bud. That's all I got. Anybody who tries to tell you more than that is selling you something. I've worked out here 40 years. I've heard the stories from the locals and the tribe and the old-timers at the agency, and most of these stories don't agree with each other on a single detail except one. Every person who's told me one of those stories said the same thing at the end of it. They said, "You'll know." There was a long, quiet moment. I was trying to figure out what to say or ask to pry more information out of him. But then he said, "I'll tell you the other thing they all said. They said don't go looking for it. If you see one, you don't ever go looking for it again on purpose. Some folks have, and most of those folks aren't around anymore to talk about how it went." That's the answer, kid. That's what I've got. He went back to his knife and whatever business he had with it. I knew that was him saying, "We're done here." I went back to my cabin that night, lay in my bunk, staring at the rafters. The rain had stopped, and the silence outside felt very creepy. It was that extra silent silence after a storm. I tried telling myself I didn't believe the old guy. I had a contract to finish up. I didn't have time to believe in some ghost story. Even so, I was a bit afraid of the dark that night. Several more contracts came and went over the following months. Then in October of 1995, I got the one that ended up changing things. The BLM was running this elk reduction program in a section of foothills north of Roosevelt, where the population had grown past what the range could carry, and they wanted somebody to bring the numbers down before winter. I took it without thinking twice. There was good pay to be had on this one, and the country was beautiful. And I knew the area from a previous coyote contract I'd run 2 years before. I was glad to be back. The work itself was straightforward. I had a 30-day window, a quota of 24 animals, and access to a Forest Service cabin about 6 miles up a graded road from the highway. I spent the first week scouting the herds in the early morning and late evening. By day 8, I'd taken 5 animals and was ahead of schedule. The day this happened was a Wednesday, in mid-October. It was easy for me to remember because it was my mom's birthday. I'd called her from a payphone in Roosevelt that morning before driving back up to my position. The weather had been clear all week. The aspens were peak yellow, and the air had a cold, dry edge to it. The snow line was starting to creep down the Uintas. I was set up on a low ridge overlooking a long meadow that ran along a creek bottom. The ridge was about 60 feet above the meadow, and from where I was, I could see about half a mile of the creek in either direction. Pine forest came in close on the far side. Aspens ran up the draws. My rifle was on a bipod, and I had the scope dialed in for the meadow's far edge, where a good bull had been showing up every other evening for the last 3 days. The light was just starting to soften, maybe an hour and a half before sunset. I had a thermos of coffee right next to me, and I was being patient. Patience is half the job on these contracts. I caught movement first in my peripheral vision, off to my left, way off where I hadn't been watching. Something was coming through the aspens above the creek and moving fast. Here come the elk, I thought. Maybe the herd had pushed a cow ahead of them and she was running. I swung the scope around. Two women. Two women were running through the aspens, moving downhill toward the meadow, both of them clearly in distress. The one in front was wearing a red fleece jacket and had dark hair in a long ponytail that was coming loose. The one behind her had on a green hiking pack and a navy beanie. She was struggling to keep up, but I could tell both of them were crying. Even at that distance, I could see it through my scope. Open mouths, twisted faces, that look of being past scared and into terrified territory. My first thought was that one of them was hurt. I scanned them for blood or limping, but I didn't see a sign of a wound. They were running flat out, panicked, looking back over their shoulders every few steps. I scanned behind them, up into the aspens. That's when I saw it. There was a figure following them. I thought it was a man, at first, or it looked like a man at least. He was tall, walking down the slope through the aspens, maybe 50 yards behind the two women. He was naked from the waist up. I want to say his skin was the color of bone, but that isn't quite right either. It was the color of dry pine, weathered, the color of something that had been outside for a season too long. He wasn't running. The two women were running, but he wasn't, and yet he was keeping up with them. That was the first thing my brain registered as completely wrong. He was walking, they were full-on sprinting, and the distance between them was staying exactly the same. I held the scope on this man, and I tried to focus. His face, I have to talk about that face. The left side, looking at him through the scope, was a young guy, somewhere in his 20s, with brown hair grown out a little, a normal jawline, a regular face you'd pass 100 times in town and never look at twice. The right side, however, was wrong. I didn't have words for it then. I still don't, really. The right side of his face was longer than the left. The jaw on that side hung lower, as though the bones underneath weren't matched up. The eye on that side was bigger and set wrong. The skin around it was a color that doesn't match anything I've ever seen on something alive. There was something about the place where the two halves came together at the center of the face that made my stomach turn, just looking at it. The two halves didn't agree with each other. It was like two different beings had been stitched onto the same skull, and each one was ignoring the other. I lowered the scope and looked at the meadow with my naked eye. The two women were still running. I could see them now without the scope. Two small, desperate figures crossing the open grass, the red one out in front. I looked back to where I'd seen the man, but I could no longer pick him out without the scope. He was gone or hidden in the trees. I put the scope back to my eye. There he was. He was still there, the same distance behind them, and the same walking pace, never breaking stride. His ribcage rose and fell slowly, slower than any breathing I'd ever watched on anything alive. I'm a Kohler. My instinct is to put the rifle on a threat. I had a clear line of sight if I'd wanted it. I'll tell you something honest. I could not make myself center the crosshairs on him. Every time I tried to bring the scope onto his head, my hands started to shake. I'm not exaggerating. I've shot hundreds of animals. I've held a scope steady on a charging boar, but I could not put the crosshairs on that thing's face. My body just refused. The two women had reached the creek. The one in front was looking for a place to cross, frantic and splashing into the shallow part. The one behind her caught up, and they crossed together, water up to their knees, both of them stumbling. They came out the other side and kept running, heading for the road, which was about 200 yards beyond the meadow on my side. I swung the scope back to the figure. He had stopped at the edge of the aspens above the creek. He was looking down at the water. From my angle, I could see the wrong side of his face better now, and the longer I looked at it, the less I could focus on it. My eyes so badly wanted to look away at something, especially the normal half of his face. Looking at the wrong half made my brain feel raw and sore, as if I was pressing on something I should never touch. Then he turned his head. His head turned slow, and he looked across the meadow, across the creek, right up the ridge to where I was lying flat with my rifle. He looked at me through the scope, and I want to be very clear. He looked through the scope. He did not look at the ridge, generally. He did not scan the area around me. He locked onto the front lens of my rifle scope and threw it into my eye. I held my breath. My finger was on the trigger guard, not the trigger. I couldn't move. My whole body had gone cold and stupid. It was the kind of cold you feel when you wake up at night and just know something is in the room with you, something that shouldn't be there. He smiled at me then. The normal side of his face smiled. The other side did something that I can't even describe, but at best I could say it was like a tremor, a seizure on one half of the face only. Two halves of the same face doing completely different things. Then he turned and walked back up into the aspens. I held the scope on him until the trees swallowed him up. I kept it on the spot he'd disappeared into until my arms began to ache. When I finally lowered the rifle and got up off the ridge, my legs weren't working anymore. I slid most of the way back down the side of the ridge instead of climbing down. I got into my truck with my hands shaking, and I drove back to the cabin without remembering most of the road in between. I called dispatch from the cabin radio. I told them I had seen two female hikers running scared out of an area where there shouldn't have been hikers. I told them they'd been heading toward the highway, but they looked like they were in trouble. I gave them the location, the time, and a description of the two. One a red fleece, the other a green pack, and they both looked maybe in their late 20s. I wanted to say something about the man, but I didn't know how I could. I sat with the radio mic in my hand trying to find the right words, but eventually I just signed off. 2 hours later, dispatch called me back. They'd found the women, thankfully, both safe, picked up by a sheriff's deputy on the highway, about 3 miles south of where I'd seen them cross the creek. They were shaken up, but unhurt. They told the deputy they'd been hiking and got lost. Then they got scared, because they thought they heard something following them in the woods. The deputy logged it as a lost hiker incident, and that was the end of it. But that wasn't a lost hiker situation that I saw. I watched them closely through my scope. They knew exactly where they were. They were running from something specific. The next day, I drove down to the BLM field office in Roosevelt and asked to speak to my supervisor. He was a guy named Blum. He was in his 50s, ex-military, polite enough, but never anything you'd call warm. He took me into his office and shut the door. I told him everything I'd seen, walking him through it slowly, play by play. I told him, of course, about the two women in the meadow, and about the figure that had come down through the aspens behind them. I told him about the face being wrong on one side, and about how the figure had stopped at the edge of the trees and turned to look directly at me through my scope. Blum listened without interrupting. He nodded a couple of times. He took a few notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, he set the pen down and folded his hands on his desk. "You doing okay out there?" he said. That wasn't the response I expected. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you sleeping enough out there? You eating good? You've been on this contract by yourself for what? Almost 2 weeks now. I sleep fine, sir. I eat good, and I know what I saw. Blum picked up the pen again and tapped it against his pad, but he didn't write down anything. Then he started in gently. Tell me what you've been eating out there, he said. What? Out at the cabin. Walk me through a day for you. Breakfast, lunch, what you carry in your pack. Blum, I don't see what that has to do with anything. Just humor me. I told him. Coffee in the morning, jerky and a granola bar in the pack, whatever I cooked at the cabin in the evening, usually canned chili or pasta. He nodded along with every part of it. Do you ever get lightheaded out there? Hands shaky on the rifle? Anything like that? 2 weeks alone in the field, eating like that, a man can run his blood sugar pretty low without realizing it. My hands weren't shaky. What time of day did you see this? Maybe an hour and a half before sunset, but the light was still good. Right around the time the light starts doing things. You ever notice that? That hour when the shadows get long, you can pick up movement out of the corner of your eye that isn't really there, especially through a scope. Especially when you've had a scope to your eye for an hour or two waiting on a bull. The brain gets tired, you start filling things in. You know. I sat there and listened to him do this. I'd been on enough contracts to know what was happening. He wasn't asking me questions. He was offering me an explanation, gently, almost coaxing me into it. He wanted me to walk out of his office having decided what I saw was some mirage caused by tiredness. Blum, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not tired. My blood sugar is fine, and I know what I saw. There was a flicker of something on his face, a half-second where the concerned supervisor look slipped, and something else had come through. There was nothing surprised about it. The flicker instead was annoyance. A man hoping he wouldn't have to do the next part of his job. It came and went so fast I nearly missed it. Then that fake concern was back on his face. Tell you what, take a couple of days, stay at the cabin or head home, my treat. I'll cover you with the contract office. I've seen plenty of guys need a breather around the 2-week mark. Not a big deal, just think about it, okay? I don't need days off. I didn't ask you, son. I'm offering. You think about it. Then he leaned forward. And in the meantime, do me a favor. Don't talk about this with anybody. I'm not just talking about the guys at the field stations. I mean, anybody at all, including the locals in town, including your own mother on the phone. The agency has its own process for this kind of thing, and I don't want the reports to get muddied. That part gave me chills. Blum was a man who said things directly, never with much heat behind them. This time there was something behind his words. A little bit of warning, a little bit of pressure, almost a threat. This man wasn't asking me to keep quiet. He was telling me. I told him I'd think about it. I left his office and walked out to my truck, sitting there in the cab. I had to make myself turn the key. I knew. By the time I was driving back to the cabin, I knew it for sure. Blum had not been surprised by my story. He had been waiting on it. Maybe not from me specifically, but he'd been waiting for someone to come into his office with a story like the one I had just told him. And he had a script ready. A script he'd run through in order. That night I sat in the cabin and just thought. Henry's story kept coming back at me. The boots set out on that rock with the laces tied. Caleb walking out the cabin door at 3 a.m. and never being seen again. And under all of it sat the figure across the meadow, looking right up at the ridge at me, smiling with half of a face that did not agree with itself. The thing that stuck with me hardest was that smile. He'd known I was there, from a quarter mile of cover, with nothing showing but the front lens of a rifle scope. He had known, and he wanted me to know that he knew. That was the start of me believing. I tried to convince myself the worst of it was over. Blum had told me to take a couple of days off, and I figured I'd use them to clear my head. I'd stay at the cabin, finish out the rest of the contract, and put what happened behind me. The smarter version of me would have packed up that night, driven back to my mom's house in Salt Lake. The version of me sitting in that cabin in 1995 was 24 years old and stubborn, and did not want to walk away from a contract he was already halfway through. That first night was when things started to feel wrong in an entirely different way. After staying in that cabin long enough, I knew its sounds. The floorboards settled when the temperature dropped, and there was a squirrel in the rafters that ran across the roof at sunrise. I'd gotten used to all of it and slept through it just fine. That first night was different. I lay in the bunk with my eyes open until past 1 in the morning. Every time I started to drift off, my brain would replay the figure standing at the edge of the aspens, looking up the ridge through my scope, and I'd be wide awake again. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and got up to make coffee. That's when I heard the first thing. It came from the woods behind the cabin, about 20 yards in the pines. I heard a voice from the trees, a woman's voice calling out, hurt and trying to be heard. She was calling out a name. She was begging for someone to come find her. I stood there listening with the coffee pot in my hand, and something under my conscious brain started to slow me down. The voice was a little too clear. Out in those woods 20 yards back in the pines, you wouldn't hear a person calling that clean. The trees and brush should have softened it. The wind should have carried pieces of it away. The voice I was hearing was coming through with no interference at all, as clean as a recording. Then I caught myself. I sat there in the cabin with the coffee pot in my hand. I hadn't moved. My body had already known something I hadn't worked out yet. I was a quarter mile up a graded road from the highway, on a section of Forest Service land where there were no trailheads inside 3 miles. The closest residence was 8 miles south. There shouldn't have been a hiker at 2 in the morning, 20 yards from my cabin. There definitely shouldn't have been one yelling for help in a perfect, clear voice from the middle of the trees. I set the coffee pot down. I didn't go to the radio or the door. I sat down on the floor with my back to the wall facing the door, and I picked up my rifle. I waited. The voice kept calling for about 10 minutes, then it stopped. I sat by the wall with the rifle across my lap until the sun came up. I never heard anything else. The night stayed silent until light came through the window. In the morning, I made myself drive into Roosevelt for breakfast. The diner was open. I had eggs and coffee and tried to act normal. The waitress was a woman named Dee, who had served me on every contract I'd worked out of Roosevelt, going back 2 years. She filled my cup and asked how the elk hunt was going. I told her it was going fine. She looked at me a bit longer than usual, topped my cup off again even though it didn't need it, and walked away without saying another word. I left her a bigger tip than I usually left, and I got out of there. I kept thinking about what Blum had said about not talking to anyone. I assumed he told me that for 2 reasons. The agency wanted to control the story, sure, but underneath that, he'd been warning me about something else, something he'd let slip without meaning to. That something else was the part I couldn't shake. Blum had told me not to mention it, as if mentioning it out loud would make it worse, as if speaking about the thing was part of the problem. I drove out to the field station that afternoon, and I looked for Henry. He wasn't there. The duty officer told me Henry had wrapped up his last consulting day and had gone home, so he wasn't expected back. I asked for a phone number. The duty officer said agency policy didn't allow him to give that out. I drove back to my cabin and sat on the porch step with my rifle across my knees, and I watched the tree line until the light went. That night was quiet, and the night after that was too. I started to think maybe the first night had been a fluke. A bad night and nothing more. Day 3 after the meeting. I went back out to my position on the ridge. I needed to finish the contract. The bull I'd been waiting on had been showing up regular, and I had a quota to meet. I told myself I was being a professional, and that I wasn't going to let one bad night cost me the second half of my pay. I set up. I got prone behind the rifle. I scanned the meadow. The bull came up out of the trees on schedule, big 6-point, exactly where I'd been expecting him. I had him in the scope, breathing slow, finger on the trigger guard. Then he picked his head up and looked across the meadow. He was looking at the same edge of aspens where that figure had been 3 days before. His ears swiveled forward. His whole body went stiff. He wasn't grazing anymore. He was watching something. I held very still. I didn't put the scope on the aspens. Whatever that bull saw, I didn't want anything to do with it. After about 30 seconds, the bull turned and walked back into the trees on his side of the meadow. He wasn't running, just walking, head still turned toward the aspens until he was out of sight. I packed up, and I went back to the cabin. That night would be another bad night. It started around midnight. I was in bed, but not asleep. I'd been keeping the rifle on the bunk next to me since the first night. I heard footsteps on the porch. A single set of footsteps came across the porch and stopped at the door. I lay there with my hand on the rifle and my heart trying to climb out of my chest. The footsteps had been heavy, the weight of a man. Then I heard breathing. It was right on the other side of the door, slow, slower than any breathing should be. It was the same slow breath I'd watched on the figure across the meadow when he'd been walking down the slope through the aspens. I didn't move or speak. I didn't even reach for the rifle, even though it was right there, because some part of me had already understood that picking up the rifle would make this worse. I lay there with my eyes on the door and listened to it breathe. It stayed at the door for I don't know how long. Eventually, the breathing stopped. I never heard footsteps go back across the porch. The breathing was there and then it wasn't, and the porch was empty. I waited for the sun. When the light came through the curtains, I made myself open the door. The porch was empty. I checked the dust on the boards for prints and found none. Whatever had stood there had not left a single mark, just like Henry's story. That morning was when I packed up. I left the cabin and drove back to my mom's house in Salt Lake. I called Blum from her kitchen phone and told him I was taking the rest of those days he'd offered. He sounded relieved. He told me to take a week if needed. For the first few nights at my mom's place, I slept with the lights on. I know she noticed, but she didn't ask why. She knew something had happened on the contract. After all, she had raised me. She could read me. But all I said was that it had been a hard one, and I was tired. She made me French toast, my favorite. I tried Henry one more time. I called the field station one day, but they said they'd pass on a message because he wasn't there. But he called me back 2 days later from a payphone in Vernal. I explained everything that had happened at the cabin. The voice from the trees, the bull staring at the aspens, the footsteps and breathing. I told him about the dust on the boards in the morning, how it had not been touched. He listened intently. I could hear traffic on his end. He was on a payphone near a road. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a moment and said,
"You stopped talking about it, didn't you?"
"After Blum's office, yeah, I kept it shut."
"That's good. You keep it shut. The thing you saw out there knows you saw it because you were looking at it through that scope. It locks onto attention. You stop giving it any. Far as anybody outside this conversation is concerned, that meadow never happened. You hear me?"
"Yeah."
"Did anything follow you home from that cabin?"
I told him I didn't think so. I'd checked the truck before I left. I hadn't heard anything I couldn't explain since I got back to my mom's.
Good. That part is important. Sometimes one of them latches on, and the people that happens to don't get to live normal anymore. They have to do other things to break it loose. You don't sound like one of them.
What kind of other things? He ignored that question. Maybe by accident, maybe on purpose.
The rest is gonna fade. Give it a few weeks. Long as you don't talk about it, and you don't sit on it in your head, it goes back to whatever it does when nobody's paying attention. But it remembers you, so you keep watching, just in case.
What do you mean by watching? He took a breath on the other end.
You'll know.
That was all he gave me. He told me to call him if anything else happened, and not to call him if it didn't. We hung up. Henry was right about it fading. I went back out 2 weeks later and finished the elk contract, and I didn't see anything I couldn't explain. I came in under quota, got my pay, and accepted the next contract that came up. I worked the Uintah Basin for another 9 years after that. I never saw anything as clear as what I'd seen in that meadow. There were nights I felt watched. Some mornings I'd find tracks near my cabin or near my truck that didn't match any animal I ever knew. But nothing ever came close to what I'd seen across that creek. I followed Henry's rules. I didn't talk about it with anyone, including my mom, not even when I was dating somebody serious. When someone at a hardware store or bar mentioned the word in passing, I'd nod and change the subject. For about 30 years, I kept my word. I stayed quiet, kept working contracts in the basin until I aged out of the long ones. Then I worked shorter contracts in northern Utah until I retired in 2018. I had a couple of long-term relationships but never married, never had kids. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand. I've thought a lot about whether to say anything. I made a choice to stay quiet for almost 30 years, so when I tell you I'm choosing to break that silence now, understand it's not on a whim. I'm reaching out now because I'm getting older, and I've been thinking too much. I think about the people in that BLM office who knew exactly what I was reporting and decided to feed me a line about blood sugar. I keep coming back to Caleb's family who got a death certificate and some story about a ledge. And I think about those 2 women in the meadow who got logged as a lost hiker incident and probably went home trying to convince themselves that what they saw was a bear or a man with a knife. So what I want to tell you is that the government knows. Put that on record. The agencies know about it, all of them, and somebody well above Blum's pay grade has been managing the story for longer than I've been alive. I'd bet good money on it that it goes back further than that. A lot further. People who report things get the blood sugar lecture and the offer of a couple days off. People who push back get nudged toward signing something or going home for good. The people who could have told this story alongside me are mostly gone. Wes died in 2014, Henry in 2008, and Ben moved to Arizona 27 years ago. I've never been able to find him since. Henry was the only one I ever told the full story to, and he was the only person who ever told me how to handle what comes after. I'm breaking my silence now because Henry is not around to tell me to keep my mouth shut anymore. 30 years go by. He told me to keep watching just in case, and I've kept watching because there are skinwalkers in those woods. It's crazy how you don't even need much action or face-to-face terror in a skinwalker story like this to walk away feeling like you need 3 showers a day and twice the wattage in every light fixture in your home. Remember, when you speak of them, they will come. So be careful what you say. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails, and I need your help. If you want EerieCast and Tales from the Break Room to keep going, think about signing up for membership over at Eerie.fm. That's EERIE.fm. It's the new best place to listen to EerieCast shows like this. And if you sign up for premium, you unlock tons of extra hours of my narrations that you can't get anywhere else. Thank you so much. Until next time, everyone, I'll be clocking out, but I'll be back again real soon.